Section 1. The Golden Age. What made Family Guy great? Seasons 1 to 3. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles in when you put on something you've already watched 100 times. Not the silence of boredom, but the specific hush of familiarity, of knowing the beats before they arrive, of watching something like you'd watch the rain on a window present, unhurried, comfortable. That's what this is. You don't have to focus. You don't have to follow along like it's new. Just settle in and let the story wash over you, because tonight we're going somewhere that a lot of people have strong feelings about, and we're going to take it slow. Family Guy is a show that most people who grew up watching television in the late 90s and early 2000s have a deep, personal relationship with. It's the kind of show that was on in the background of bedrooms and living rooms for years. The kind of show you quoted at school. The kind of show that felt like it was speaking a language that only your generation fully understood. And then somewhere along the way, slowly enough that you almost didn't notice, something changed. The show that made you laugh until you couldn't breathe started feeling like something else entirely. The characters you loved started acting like strangers. The humor that felt sharp and clever started feeling mean or lazy or just hollow. Tonight we're going to talk about why that happened. Not quickly, not in a list, but carefully and thoroughly, the way something this significant deserves to be examined. We're going to go through the entire arc of Family Guy, from the first time a young animator named Seth MacFarlane pitched a ridiculous concept about a Rhode Island family to a skeptical network, all the way to the present day, where that same show is still somehow being made even though most of the original magic left a long time ago. We're going to talk about the characters, the writing, the business decisions, the creative choices, and the slow, grinding process by which one of the most beloved animated comedies in television history became a shadow of the thing that launched it. So get comfortable. Dim the lights if you want. Let yourself breathe. This is going to take a while, and that's the whole point. Let's go back to the very beginning. Seth MacFarlane was born in Kent, Connecticut in October of 1973. He was drawing before he could properly write. By the time he was 5 years old, he was filling notebooks with cartoon characters and submitting hand-drawn comic strips to a local newspaper that paid him $5 for each one. The kid understood, even at that age, that there was something in him that needed to find a way out through pen and paper, through the specific magic of a drawn line that could make someone laugh. He went to the Rhode Island School of Design, one of the most respected art and design schools in the country, to study animation. At RISD, he was absorbing everything. He studied the technical craft of animation with a seriousness that would define the rest of his career. He also started doing stand-up comedy on the side, which gives you some insight into the kind of person he was becoming, not just someone who wanted to make art, but someone who wanted to make people laugh, who was genuinely interested in the rhythm and timing of a joke, in the specific mechanics of what makes something funny versus what makes something merely surprising. His thesis film at RISD, completed in 1995, was called The Life of Larry. It was an animated short about a middle-aged, overweight man named Larry Cummings, his talking dog Steve, his wife Lois, and his overweight teenage son Milt. The film included cutaway gags. It had a character who talked about his feelings while his family barely paid attention. It had an energy that was clearly influenced by MacFarlane having watched The Simpsons and thought, I want to do something like that, but different and mine. If you watch The Life of Larry today, you can see the DNA of Family Guy in almost every frame. The dog would become Brian Griffin. Larry would become Peter Griffin. MacFarlane based Peter's voice on a security guard he once overheard speaking while he was a student at RISD, that specific nasally, working-class cadence that would become one of the most recognizable voices in animation. The wife already shared a name with Lois Griffin. Even the structural setup of a chaotic, lovable man, surrounded by people who were slightly too smart or slightly too strange for him, was already present. A professor at RISD submitted MacFarlane's thesis film to Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio behind classics like The Flintstones and Scooby-Doo, which had by then become Cartoon Network Studios. MacFarlane was hired almost immediately. He spent the next couple of years working on shows like Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, and Cow and Chicken. He was learning the craft from the inside, seeing how professional animation production actually worked, absorbing the rhythms of scripted comedy at an institutional level. In 1996, he made a sequel to The Life of Larry called Larry and Steve, which was shown as part of Cartoon Network's world premiere Toons. That short sharpened the concept even further. The talking dog became more fully realized. The dynamic between an intelligent animal and a hapless human owner was becoming something with real comedic potential. And then, in 1998, McFarlane took everything he had been building toward and walked into Fox with it. The pitch was for a 15-minute pilot. McFarlane went into those meetings not just as a pitchman, but as a performer. He voiced all the main characters himself right there in the room. He was 24 years old. He had a clear vision, a specific sense of humor, and an almost alarming fluency with the world he was proposing to build. Fox said yes. They gave him a budget, a green light, and told him to make a pilot. That pilot would become the series premiere of Family Guy, which aired on the 31st of January 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33. 22 million people watched that first episode. Let that number settle for a moment. 22 million people. The Super Bowl time slot was doing an enormous amount of work in generating that initial number, but even accounting for the context, 22 million viewers for a brand new animated show about a boorish working-class man and his dysfunctional Rhode Island family was a statement. People tuned in and then they stayed, because what they saw was something genuinely, surprisingly good. The world of the show was set in a fictional town in Rhode Island. The Griffin family lived in a house that felt real in the way that animated spaces feel real when someone has thought carefully about what makes a home feel lived in. Peter Griffin was the father, overweight and chronically foolish, working at the happy-go-lucky toy factory before eventually getting a job at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. Lois was his wife, patient in a way that felt genuine rather than performative, a piano teacher and stay-at-home mom who loved her family even when they were impossible. Their daughter Meg was a regular, unpopular teenager, the kind of girl who wanted more than she had and struggled with the gap between who she was and who she wanted to be in the way that real teenagers actually struggle. Their son Chris was awkward and clueless in the gentle way of a kid who hasn't yet figured out what he's doing in the world. The baby Stewie was secretly an evil genius who spoke like a Bond villain and spent most of his time trying to take over the world or kill his mother. And then there was Brian, the family dog, who walked on two legs, drank dry martinis, drove a car, and was genuinely the most intelligent person in the house. That setup sounds chaotic on paper, and in a sense it was. But what made it work in those first 3 seasons was how carefully the dynamics between these characters were calibrated. Every person in this family had a role that balanced against every other role. Peter was the chaos agent, but he meant well. Lois was the anchor who kept things from completely flying apart. The kids each occupied a different kind of ordinary, the social climber, the oblivious one. Stewie was the extraordinary element, the one who gave the show its single most original idea. And Brian was the audience surrogate, the character through whose eyes you understood and processed all the madness happening around him. Peter Griffin in those early years was a character built on a specific kind of comedy. He was dumb, genuinely and consistently dumb, but his stupidity was rooted in a kind of innocent obliviousness rather than malice. He wasn't trying to be a bad person. He was trying to be a good person and just failing comprehensively and hilariously at almost every attempt. In Season 1, there's a quality to Peter that is almost tender. He loves Lois in a way that is ridiculous and genuine at the same time. He loves his kids, even when he forgets their names or misunderstands what they need. He's the kind of man who would try to do the right thing and accidentally cause a small disaster and then feel genuinely bad about it and then try to make it right and accidentally cause a slightly larger disaster. That cycle was the engine of his comedy, and it worked because underneath all the failure, there was sincerity. Brian, in those first 3 seasons, was a character of genuine depth and charm. He was a failed novelist who drank too much and carried a quiet torch for Lois that he never acted on. He was witty in a way that felt earned rather than performed. When Peter was spiraling, Brian was the one who tried to apply the brakes, and when that failed, he was the one who helped pick up the pieces. Their friendship felt real. The dynamic of a thoughtful, intelligent dog and his oblivious but lovable best friend was one of the central pleasures of watching the early show. You could feel that someone had thought carefully about what it would mean for these 2 specific people to genuinely like each other. And Stewie. There is simply no overstating how original Stewie Griffin was when Family Guy first premiered. The concept of an evil genius baby was not new. In principle, cartoons had played with the idea of precocious, extraordinary children before. But Stewie was something else entirely. He wasn't precocious. He wasn't funny in the way a clever child is funny. He was genuinely, darkly, elaborately menacing. He built weapons in his room. He constructed mind control devices. He wrote complex plans for world domination in a diary while Lois changed his diaper. He spoke with a refined British accent in complete, sophisticated sentences while everyone around him heard only babbling. The comedy was rooted in contrast, this tiny creature in a diaper and a yellow shirt, sitting in a high chair, calmly discussing the geopolitical implications of his latest scheme to eliminate Lois Griffin while she tried to feed him his lunch. The dramatic irony, the audience knowing something the character didn't, gave every single scene with Stewie an extra layer of tension and delight. The writing in those first 3 seasons was sharp in a specific way. The show always had cutaway gags that was built into its DNA from the very first episode. But in the early years, those cutaways were shorter, punchier, and they existed alongside strong plots rather than replacing them. An episode in Season 1, or Season 2, or Season 3 had a real story. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. The characters were in situations that revealed who they were and what they cared about. The cutaways were like bonuses, tiny little gifts of absurdity that added flavor to something that was already working. You could have stripped every cutaway out of a Season 2 episode and still had a complete, satisfying piece of television. The show was that solid underneath the flash. What made the early show feel different from what came later was something harder to quantify but immediately felt by anyone who watches the old episodes now. It had warmth. The Griffins were a mess. They were chaotic and absurd, and occasionally genuinely awful to each other. But under all of that, there was love. Peter would do something catastrophically stupid and hurtful, and by the end of the episode, he would come to Lois with his hat in his hands and tell her he was sorry. He would hug her. He would mean it. The family that was falling apart through the middle of the episode would come back together by the end of it. The kids annoyed each other the way real siblings do, with a kind of rough fondness underneath the irritation. Even Meg, who would later become the target of some of the most sustained cruelty in animated television history, was treated with something like basic dignity in those first 3 years. She was the ordinary one, yes. She was the least interesting by the standards of her extraordinary family. But Peter didn't hate her. The show didn't hate her. She was just a teenage girl trying to navigate a family that was a lot, and there was a gentleness in how that was handled that made her feel like a real person rather than a prop. The writing staff that MacFarlane assembled for those first 3 seasons included people like Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, and Mike Barker. These were writers who were deeply aligned with MacFarlane's specific sensibility, and you could feel that alignment in the consistency of tone. When you watch a Season 1 episode and a Season 3 episode back-to-back, they feel like they belong to the same world, made by the same people with the same values. MacFarlane himself was deeply involved in every level of the production, not just doing the voices of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, but in the writing, the animation direction, the overall creative vision. He wasn't just lending his name to the project, he was steering it. One specific quality of the early writing that deserves more attention than it typically gets is the intelligence of the cultural references. Family Guy has always been a show that makes pop culture references. This is one of its defining characteristics, baked in from the beginning. But there is a meaningful difference between how those references work in the early seasons versus how they work in the later ones. In the original run, the references were specific enough to reveal something. When Peter compared his situation to an episode of a show nobody had watched in 20 years, the joke wasn't that the reference existed, it was the precision of it. The fact that whoever chose that specific reference had thought carefully about what exactly matched about the comparison. There was a quality of genuine knowledge operating behind the cultural literacy. In the later seasons, the references became broader and less specific. The show would reference recent popular things because they were recent and popular, not because there was a particular reason that specific thing illuminated the particular moment. This transition from references as tools to references as decoration is subtle but reveals a shift in how the writers were working. The early show used cultural knowledge. The later show deployed it. The specific qualities of the early animation deserve attention too, beyond just noting that it felt more handmade. Rough Draft Studios, which handled seasons 2 and 3, had a specific approach to character expression that made the comedy land differently. The timing of facial expressions in those seasons is remarkably precise. Peter's face when he realizes he's in trouble, Brian's expression of weary tolerance, Stewie's specific brand of menace, the way his features arranged themselves when he was about to say something darkly brilliant. These were performances in the fullest sense of the word, realized by animators who understood what each character was doing and why. The later animation was technically more sophisticated in many ways, but it was also less expressive, more concerned with consistency and cleanliness than with the specific, slightly rough-edged life that the early seasons had. There is something else about the early show that is worth naming, which is how unusual it was in the specific landscape of 1999 television. The Simpsons had been defining adult animated comedy since 1989. It had established that animation for adults was viable, that complex characters and genuine social commentary could exist in the animated format. But The Simpsons was, by 1999, already 10 years into its run and had already started showing the first signs of the very decline that would eventually consume it too. Family Guy arrived as something genuinely different. Not a Simpsons successor or imitator, but a different proposition entirely. The specific register of its humor, the combination of warm sitcom family dynamics and completely unhinged non-sequitur comedy occupied a space that The Simpsons hadn't tried to own and that South Park was occupying. Differently. Family Guy wasn't doing what either of them was doing. It was doing something of its own. That originality is easy to overlook now, when the format it established has been so widely replicated, but in 1999 it was genuinely new. But then Fox did what Fox tends to do. During its second season, the network moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9:00 the evening, which placed it directly opposite Frasier on NBC, one of the most critically beloved and popularly successful sitcoms on television at the time. The ratings dropped, so Fox moved it again, this time to Tuesday nights, where it was immediately crushed by the runaway phenomenon of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. Fox kept shuffling the show around with little warning, giving the audience no stable time slot to find and keep, and the ratings continued to deteriorate under the weight of scheduling chaos that had nothing to do with the quality of the product. By the end of the third season, in the spring of 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy for the second time. The show was done, except it wasn't. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of television. Cartoon Network bought the rights to air reruns of Family Guy on their Adult Swim programming block, and they bought those rights for almost nothing, because at that point nobody thought the show had any significant value. The reruns began airing on Adult Swim on April 20th of 2003, and almost immediately something extraordinary happened. Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the entire block. It dominated late-night viewing not just against cable competition but against broadcast television as well. It boosted Adult Swim's viewership by 239%. That's not a rounding error. That's the show completely transforming the numbers for an entire network's programming block. Simultaneously, the DVD releases of the first and second seasons hit shelves and sold over 400,000 copies within a single month, eventually becoming the best-selling television DVD set of 2003. Family Guy was, at that point, the first show in television history whose revival was driven directly by DVD sales. The fans who had lost the show weren't just passively mourning. They were actively buying the thing they missed, collecting it, rewatching it, showing it to people who hadn't seen it. They were making the economic case for bringing it back in the most direct way possible. Fox, the same network that had canceled Family Guy twice, took notice. By 2004, they had ordered new episodes. The fourth season was set to premiere in May of 2005. Fans celebrated. The show was coming back from the dead, which almost never happens, and there was genuine joy in the fact of it. But as we're going to spend the next several hours exploring, the show that came back in 2005 was not quite the same show that had left in 2002. The 3-year gap had consequences. And those consequences would only compound, season by season, choice by choice, until the show had become something its original audience barely recognized. Before we move forward, drop a comment and let me know where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there. I love seeing where in the world this reaches, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. It helps more than you'd think. Section 2. The Resurrection and the Cracks, Seasons 4 and 5. The fourth season of Family Guy premiered on the 1st of May 2005, and Fox treated it like an event. They placed it at the center of their Sunday night animation lineup, which they were now branding as Animation Domination, a block that included The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a brand new McFarlane creation called American Dad, which had premiered just a few months earlier in February. The hype was enormous. The people who had built that cult following through Adult Swim reruns and DVD purchases showed up in genuine numbers. The season premiere drew over 11 million viewers. The comeback was real, and for a while, it felt like everything was going to be fine. The show was back, the voices were back, the characters were back. Peter was still bumbling around Pawtucket, Lois was still holding the family together by the skin of her teeth, Stewie was still monologuing about world domination, Brian was still sighing at Peter's latest disaster over a dry martini. There was a comfort in the return that made it easy, initially, to overlook some of the ways things had shifted. But things had shifted. The most immediately visible change was in the animation. The first 3 seasons of Family Guy had a specific visual texture to them, rougher around the edges, more handmade in the way that drawings look when they're made by people who are working with limited resources, and making up for it with energy and expressiveness. Rough Draft Studios had handled seasons 2 and 3, and their work gave the show a lively, almost rubbery quality that suited the comedy. Characters moved with a looseness that made the physical gags land harder. Faces were more mobile, more surprising in their expressions. The whole thing felt like it had been drawn by people who were excited about what they were drawing. The Season 4 animation was cleaner, more polished in certain technical respects, but it was also stiffer. The outlines were thicker and more uniform. The character movements had lost some of their organic quality. Watching a Season 4 episode after a Season 2 episode, you feel the difference before you consciously register what it is. Something about the visual rhythm had changed. Comedy and animation is deeply tied to timing and physical expression, and when the animation becomes more rigid, the jokes land differently, not necessarily worse, but differently. And in this case, with a loss of some of the kinetic energy that had made the early show feel so alive. This matters more than it might seem. Animation is not just a delivery system for jokes, it is part of the joke. The way a character's face reacts, the way a body falls, the way an expression transforms, these are active ingredients in what makes something funny. When those ingredients change, the recipe changes, even if you've kept everything else nominally the same. The bigger change was in the writing. McFarlane himself acknowledged this directly in interviews. When a show gets canceled, the writing staff disperses. They find other work. They move on to other projects. You cannot expect a group of writers to hold their careers in suspension for 3 years while waiting for a show that may never return. So when Family Guy came back in 2005, the writing room was not the same room that had built the first 3 seasons. Some of the original voices were gone, new voices had come in. And while none of those new voices were necessarily less talented, they brought different sensibilities, different reference points, different instincts about what the show should be and what it should feel like. The cutaway gags, which had been a defining feature of the show from the beginning, started to evolve in this period in ways that would ultimately prove damaging to the overall structure of the comedy. In the first 3 seasons, cutaways were, as noted earlier, supplemental. They added layers to an episode without becoming the main event. Starting in Season 4, the cutaways began to take on more weight. They got longer. They appeared more frequently. The plots of individual episodes started to thin out to accommodate them. Where the early show had used cutaways as seasoning, the revival seasons began using them more like the main course, with the nominal plot serving primarily as a connective tissue that linked one gag to the next. It's worth noting that many of these cutaways were still genuinely funny. Season 4 contains some of the most shared, most quoted Family Guy moments in the show's history. The specific format of the cutaway gag, the setup line, the transition, the absurd little sketch, the return was perfectly designed for the emerging culture of internet video sharing. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned to television, and the two phenomena fed each other in ways that benefited both. A 30-second Family Guy cutaway was exactly the right format for a viral video clip. Fans could extract it from the episode, upload it, and it would get millions of views from people who had never seen the original episode. This made Family Guy one of the most recognizable and most referenced shows on the early internet. But there's an important distinction here that the show would struggle to maintain as the years went on. A show that makes great moments is not the same thing as a show that tells great stories. In the early seasons, Family Guy was both. The moments were great because the stories were great. In the revival, the balance began to tip. The moments were still frequently excellent, but the stories that housed them were getting thinner. Peter's character remained mostly intact in Season 4, still recognizably the same lovable fool from the original run, but there were moments where his stupidity felt pushed to a slightly different place. In the original seasons, Peter was dumb in the way of a man who genuinely doesn't understand the consequences of his actions, who is operating from a place of genuine if misguided good intentions. In some of the Season 4 episodes, his stupidity starts edging towards something harder and more selfish. The distinction is subtle at this point, but it's there. He's beginning to do things that are less the product of cluelessness and more the product of willfulness, a character who knows on some level that what he's doing is wrong and does it anyway. Brian's character shows early signs of what will eventually become a defining and deeply problematic trait in later seasons, the tendency to use him as a vehicle for political editorializing. Brian had always been the most politically aware character on the show, and that was fine. It was part of who he was, balanced against his other qualities. In Season 4, that political element starts to take up more space. There are scenes where Brian delivers what can only be described as speeches, where the writing drops the pretense of dialogue and has the character just delivering a position directly to the audience. It's not overwhelming in Season 4, but it's a development worth tracking because it gets much worse. The most significant character transformation happening in this era is Stewie's. The writers, including MacFarlane, had decided that the evil genius baby premise had been explored as far as it could go. They felt they had exhausted the material. So, starting in Season 4, Stewie's personality begins a slow pivot away from villainy and towards something softer, more emotionally complex, and more focused on his relationship with Brian. The world domination plots become less frequent. The attempts on Lois's life begin to fade into the background. In their place, a new Stewie emerges, one who has feelings, who craves connection, who is navigating questions of identity in ways that a one-year-old villain had never had to navigate before. Some of this worked. The developing friendship between Stewie and Brian during this period is genuinely charming. Their dynamic has a different texture than the Peter and Brian dynamic, where Peter and Brian were fundamentally incompatible in ways that made their friendship both funny and touching. Stewie and Brian were more like equals who happened to exist in wildly different circumstances, and watching them find each other was actually quite lovely. The Road to episode's special two-character adventure stories featuring the two of them traveling together became some of the most beloved installments of the revival era. The chemistry was real, but the trade-off was enormous and would only become more apparent over time. The evil genius baby was, simply put, one of the most original character concepts in the history of animated television. There was nothing like Stewie Griffin anywhere else in the medium. He was unique in a way that matters enormously for a show that was trying to carve out its own space in a crowded landscape. By retiring the evil genius and replacing him with a more emotionally accessible, more conventionally funny sidekick character, the show lost something irreplaceable. The new Stewie was entertaining. The original Stewie was extraordinary. Season 5, which ran from September 2006 through May 2007, continued the trends that Season 4 had established, while also producing some episodes that are genuinely considered among the best the show ever made. The season premiere, Stewie Loves Lois, took a completely unexpected angle on the Stewie and Lois relationship and delivered real emotional complexity. Road to Rupert, another Stewie and Brian adventure episode, showed the show at its most purely enjoyable, funny, inventive, and genuinely warm. Barely Legal, an episode where Meg develops a crush on Brian after he takes her to prom out of pity, demonstrated that the show could still generate sharp, character-driven comedy when it committed to actually telling a story instead of just stringing gags together. These episodes proved something important. The talent was still there. The writers in this period were capable of producing brilliant television. The question was whether the institutional incentives of the show were going to allow them to do that consistently, or whether those incentives were going to push them toward the quicker, easier, more individually viral approach of the cutaway-heavy format. Season 5 was also the period during which the treatment of Meg Griffin first began to take on the specific flavor that would define it for the next decade. In the original 3 seasons, the humor around Meg was gentle. She was the boring one, the ordinary one, the one who wanted more than she had. In seasons 4 and 5, the jokes began to shift. Meg became ugly. Meg became undesirable. Meg became the target of her father's comments in a way that went beyond insensitivity into something that felt more like genuine contempt. The shift was still relatively mild at this point, the seeds being planted rather than the full crop growing, but looking back, you can see exactly when the show decided to take this path, and you can already feel the wrongness of it. The family itself was slowly, almost imperceptibly, losing some of its warmth. In the first 3 seasons, episodes tended to end with some form of reconnection. Peter would apologize, the family would come together. There was an emotional landing that reinforced the idea that these people, as chaotic as they were, loved each other. In the revival seasons, those landings became rarer. The chaos was still there, but the warmth that used to resolve it was fading. Not gone yet, but fading. Season 5 also produced the Road to Stewie episode format, which became one of the most beloved recurring concepts in the entire revival run. These special episodes, essentially 2-character road movies starring Brian and Stewie, had their own internal logic and their own emotional register, separate from the standard Family Guy episode structure. They were consistently the most warmly received episodes in any given season they appeared, which says something about where the show's remaining creative energy was concentrated. When the writers had permission to do something different, to step outside the standard format and build something that was character-driven from the ground up, they delivered quality. It was the standard format that was the problem, not an absence of talent, but an absence of structural conditions that required the talent to fully express itself. Despite everything, seasons 4 and 5 are still generally regarded as good television by most people who watch them. They aren't the peak of the show, but they're clearly still in the same universe as the peak, recognizable, frequently funny, capable of genuine excellence when the elements came together. If you had frozen Family Guy in amber at the end of season 5, it would be remembered as a show with a brilliant early run and a solid, if slightly diminished, revival. The characters would be remembered fondly. The humor would be remembered as smart, strange, and genuinely inventive. But the show didn't stop at season 5. And the changes that had been small and manageable in those first 2 revival seasons were about to accelerate. Section 3. The Tipping Point, seasons 6 and 7. There is a particular kind of inflection point in the life of a long-running television show, a moment when what was a gradual drift becomes a directional commitment. The show doesn't suddenly become different overnight, but in retrospect, looking back from a distance of years or decades, you can identify the seasons when the drift became a direction. For Family Guy, that period was seasons 6 and 7. Season 6 premiered on the 23rd of September 2007. Right from the beginning, fans who were paying attention noticed something was different about the look of the show. Different animation studios had handled different seasons of Family Guy throughout its run, and each transition brought visual changes that were more or less jarring depending on how far the new studio's aesthetic was from the previous one. Season 6 and into Season 7 was being handled largely by a studio called Digital Emotion. The visual result was a show that looked competent but lacked the expressiveness and energy of earlier seasons. The character outlines were flatter, the movement was more restricted. There was a mechanical quality to the animation in these seasons that made the comedy feel slightly more effortful to watch, as if the images themselves were working against the jokes rather than with them. But again, the animation was not the primary story. The primary story was what was happening at the level of writing and character. Season 6 contains one of the most ambitious and genuinely excellent things Family Guy ever produced: the 2-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie. These 2 episodes gave the audience something they had been waiting for since the first season. They showed Stewie actually following through on his grand scheme, actually dispatching Lois, actually seizing the control he had been plotting toward for years. The episodes were thrilling in a way that the show rarely managed in this era. They were dramatic, darkly funny, and emotionally resonant in a way that reminded you what the show was capable of when it decided to go all in on something. Fans loved them. Critics praised them. They felt like a gift to everyone who had been watching since the beginning. And then the twist arrived. It was all a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it had actually happened. Everything would reset to exactly where it had been before the first episode started. That twist is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's not just a creative choice in isolation. It's a signal about where the show was headed philosophically. The writers were telling the audience, through the mechanics of the story, that Family Guy was not a show where things would have real consequences. Big things could happen. Characters could appear to change dramatically. The status quo could seem to be shattered. But in the end, the reset button would always get hit. Everything would go back to normal. And the reason this matters is that it robs the audience of any real reason to be invested in what happens to these characters. If you know that any development, however significant it appears, will simply be undone without ceremony, you stop caring about developments. You stop caring about consequences. You start watching the show the way you watch a screensaver, not for what it means, but for how it looks right now. This was not a new device in television, and it's not inherently wrong to use it. But Family Guy would use it again and again, in increasingly cynical ways, until the show had essentially trained its audience to be emotionally passive. Nothing mattered because nothing was ever allowed to matter. Meanwhile, the real-world disruption of the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike hit Family Guy hard. The strike began in November of 2007. MacFarlane, who was a strong supporter of the WGA, joined the picket lines immediately and made clear that he would not complete work on Family Guy episodes while the strike was ongoing. Fox, for their part, made the decision to air 3 episodes that had been completed before the strike, finishing them without MacFarlane's input and broadcasting them as part of their November sweep schedule. MacFarlane was publicly furious. He acknowledged that Fox was technically within their rights to do it, but described it as a, in his words, colossal move that would damage their relationship if they followed through. They followed through anyway. The strike ended in February of 2008. Production resumed, but the disruption had broken something. Television writing is a collaborative, momentum-dependent process. When you interrupt it for 3 months during the middle of a season, you break the rhythm that the creative team had established. Scripts that had been planned get delayed or abandoned. Story arcs that were building towards something specific have to be reoriented. The organic development of the season's creative direction gets fragmented. And in a show that was already dealing with the challenge of maintaining quality and identity over many seasons, that fragmentation had lasting effects. Season 7, which ran from September 2008 through May 2009, shows the accumulated weight of everything that had been building in the previous 2 seasons. The humor is visibly shifting its center of gravity. In the early show, the dark jokes worked because they were constructed with intelligence. There was a setup, there was craft, there was a specific reason for the darkness to be funny, rather than just disturbing. By season 7, more and more of the humor was arriving through simple shock. Something extreme would happen on screen, and the show would present the extremity itself as the joke. The audience was supposed to react to the intensity of the thing rather than to any wit in how it was constructed. And the difference between those two things is the difference between dark comedy and simple provocation. The characters were becoming less consistent in ways that would only get more pronounced. Peter's behavior started swinging more wildly from episode to episode. In one story, he might be a moderately attentive, if deeply stupid father, and in the next, he might do something that would be genuinely alarming if it happened in real life. The variation wasn't coming from character depth. It was coming from the episodic nature of the scripts, with different writers bringing different ideas about who Peter was and not always being constrained by a consistent vision of the character. Brian was starting to deliver more extended political monologues that felt like they had wandered in from a different kind of show. And Meg was receiving treatments that were getting progressively worse with each passing episode. One specific episode from season 7, titled 420, centered on Brian leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the town. The episode caused genuine international controversy when the Venezuelan government responded to it by banning Family Guy from their broadcast networks entirely, with the Justice Minister at the time specifically citing it as an example of American media promoting drug use. Whatever your views on that episode's content, the fact that a cartoon about a silly family was generating formal government action in other countries was a sign of how far the show had pushed into territory that went well beyond just being transgressive for laughs. Season 7 also introduced what would become one of the most criticized habits of the later show: the tendency to stretch individual jokes far beyond the point where they were funny, apparently on the theory that if you committed to a bit long enough, it would become funny through sheer persistence. In the early seasons, if a physical gag or a cutaway didn't quite land, the show would move past it within a few seconds. By season 7, scenes that had already made their point were continuing for 30, 40, 60 seconds after the joke had concluded. The infamous category of the chicken fight, the recurring extended sequences where Peter and a giant anthropomorphic chicken engaged in prolonged, elaborate physical battles, began in this era. The first couple of these were genuinely inventive. By the third and fourth, the joke was clearly not the chicken fight itself, but the sheer length of it, and the audience was left to decide whether they found that meta-commentary funny or just exhausting. The general reception to seasons 6 and 7 at the time they aired was mixed. Fans and critics found things to appreciate. The Road to episodes remained reliably entertaining, and there were individual episodes in both seasons that showed the show still had the capacity for genuine excellence. The cast was still performing at a high level. The voice work was still strong. MacFarlane's performance as Peter, in particular, remained a technical achievement. He was doing something remarkably nuanced with what could have been a one-note character, finding the specific emotional register for each scene with a consistency that spoke to how deeply he understood the role. But the general consensus, even in these years when the show was still broadly popular, was that something was off. Not catastrophically, not in a way that made people stop watching or stop talking about it, but off in the specific way that something feels off when you're watching it and you keep almost having a great time but not quite getting there. The golden era was clearly behind the show at this point. The question people were beginning to ask was whether Family Guy was going through a difficult period or whether it was on a longer trajectory towards something worse. Looking back now, we know the answer. Seasons 6 and 7 weren't a rough patch. They were the threshold. The last period in which you could argue, with some evidence, that Family Guy was still fundamentally working. The last period before the character changes that had been gradual became extreme, before the humor that had been shifting became unrecognizable, before the warmth that had been cooling disappeared almost entirely. On the other side of that threshold, something was waiting that no fan of the original show was prepared for. It's worth pausing here to consider what made the early revival seasons feel different from the original ones, beyond the specific character and tonal changes. There's an argument to be made that the physical experience of watching Family Guy in the revival era was itself different. The original show aired on a network that was fighting for the show's survival at every turn, and there was a scrappiness to the production that you could feel in the work. The early episodes moved quickly, with a kind of nervous energy, not because the writers were inexperienced, but because the whole enterprise felt precarious. And the precariousness generated a certain urgency. Every episode had to be good. There was no margin for coasting. By the time the show reached its 5th and 6th seasons, it was an institution. It was animation domination's anchor. It was a cultural touchstone. And there is a specific creative danger that comes with becoming an institution, which is the danger of losing the hunger that made you good in the first place. Institutions are sustained by momentum, by the weight of their own history, by the audience's relationship with what they've been before. Individual episodes of an institution don't have to fight as hard to exist, which means they sometimes fight less hard than they should to be excellent. The voices in the recording booth remained extraordinary throughout this era. Seth MacFarlane's performance as Peter Griffin is, across every season of the show, one of the great sustained vocal performances in the history of animation. He understood every version of the character, intimately understood not just how they sounded, but why they sounded that way, what the specific emotional register of each moment required. Alex Borstein as Lois brought a warmth and precision to the role that kept the character human, even when the writing was asking her to be colder than the original conception required. Seth Green's Chris remained consistently charming. Mila Kunis found genuine depth in Meg even through the worst of the abuse seasons, locating something vulnerable and real inside the mistreatment that the character was enduring. And MacFarlane's performances as Brian and Stewie, two characters whose written versions were changing dramatically over time, stayed remarkable, even as the characters themselves became harder to love. There is something almost poignant about watching a performer give their absolute best to a character that the writing has stopped serving well. The other major development in the tipping point era that deserves more attention is what happened to Lois Griffin. In the original 3 seasons, Lois was arguably the most fully realized female character in adult animated comedy at the time. She wasn't just defined by her relationship to Peter. She had her own history, the wealthy family background she had left behind to be with Peter, the piano playing, the specific kind of patience that comes not from passivity but from genuine love. She had episodes that were hers, that explored who she was outside of her role as wife and mother. She was funny, warm, occasionally sharp-tongued, and clearly the person who understood Peter most fully. Their relationship worked because Lois was a full person in it, not just a straight man for Peter's antics. In the revival era, Lois began to drift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but measurably. The warmth that had defined her started mixing with something cooler and more detached. By the later seasons, Lois had developed a streak of selfishness that the original character didn't have, a tendency toward cold pragmatism that felt like the show had simply decided that no character in the Griffin family was allowed to be genuinely good, because genuine goodness would be at odds with the tone the show was trying to maintain. Her participation in the Meg abuse was perhaps the most damaging thing the show did to her character, not because it was explicitly cruel, though it often was, but because it made her complicit in something that the original Lois would never have been complicit in. The original Lois protected her family. The later Lois participated in harming one of its members. Her relationship with Peter also changed in ways that gradually eroded the emotional core of the show. Peter and Lois in the original run had a marriage that worked in spite of everything, in spite of his stupidity, in spite of her sometimes questionable taste in men, in spite of the chaos they consistently generated together. They loved each other in a specific, real-feeling way that transcended the silliness of the circumstances. The later seasons showed them fighting more often, loving each other less consistently, enduring each other in ways that felt less like the messy reality of a long marriage, and more like two people who had forgotten why they had chosen each other in the first place. The heartbeat of the original show, the sense that, whatever happened, Peter and Lois would land in each other's arms at the end of the episode, had slowed almost to a stop. The show's relationship with continuity also deteriorated significantly during the tipping point years and beyond. This sounds like a technical creative issue, but it matters more than it might seem. In the early seasons, what happened to the characters in one episode had some bearing on who they were in subsequent episodes. Not rigidly, this was never a show with strict ongoing continuity, but in the sense that character choices accumulated, that relationships developed, that there was a through line connecting episodes across a season. The revival era saw this continuity become increasingly optional. Episodes could contradict each other with apparent indifference. Character revelations from one story could be completely forgotten in the next. The reset button that the Stewie Kills Lois two-parter made explicit was operating everywhere, all the time, invisibly and consistently. This had a specific effect on the audience's relationship with the show. It made it impossible to invest in anything that happened. If you knew that any development would simply be erased, that any growth was temporary, that any revelation would be forgotten by next week, then watching the show became a purely episodic experience, not in the satisfying way that some shows work episodically, where each episode is a complete, self-contained thing, but in a dissatisfying way where nothing builds toward anything and the cumulative effect of watching is nil. You could watch 10 seasons of Family Guy and end up knowing no more about the characters than you did after the first episode, because nothing they had done or become in the intervening 10 seasons would still be true. The irony of all this is that the show was clearly capable of doing better. The exceptional episodes scattered throughout the tipping point era and beyond demonstrate this with the unfairness of evidence. Brian and Stewie, Road to the Multiverse, Peter's Sister, Back to the Pilot. These episodes exist not as evidence that the show was secretly good, but as evidence that the show knew how to be good and was choosing, most of the time, to be something else instead. That choice, not the inability to do better, but the decision not to, is what makes the whole story of Family Guy's decline not tragic in the classical sense, where forces beyond control bring something down, but something more like an avoidable loss. On the other side of that threshold, something was waiting that no fan of the original show was prepared for. Section 4. The Flanderization of Peter Griffin. There is a word in the vocabulary of television criticism that gets used to describe one of the most common and most damaging things that happens to characters on long-running shows. That word is Flanderization. The term comes from a character on The Simpsons named Ned Flanders, who in the early seasons of that show was a three-dimensional person, devoutly religious, yes, but also genuinely kind, patient, interesting, and capable of real emotional complexity. Over years of The Simpsons continuing past its creative prime, the writers gradually stripped away every quality Ned had except his religiosity. By the time the term became widely used, Ned Flanders had become a walking shorthand for a single trait, hollowed out from a person into a symbol. Flanderization has become one of the central concepts in how fans talk about the decline of long-running animated comedies, and Family Guy may be the single most extreme case of it in the history of the medium. Multiple characters on the show have been Flanderized to the point of unrecognizability over the course of its run, but no character has undergone a more complete and more damaging transformation than the man at the center of everything, Peter Griffin himself. To understand the full scope of what happened to Peter, you have to hold two images in your mind simultaneously. The first is the Peter of Season 1 through Season 3. That Peter is a working-class dad from Rhode Island who works at a brewery, drinks beer with his friends at a bar called the Drunken Clam, and lives in a state of essentially permanent, cheerful incompetence. He is not smart. He is not responsible. He makes decisions that are consistently, spectacularly bad. But he loves his family. He loves Lois in a way that is real and tender beneath all the slapstick. He loves his children, even when he can't quite remember all their names. He is capable of apologizing when he hurts people. He is capable of recognizing his failures and trying, however clumsily, to correct them. He is a good person who is also an idiot, and that combination is endlessly funny because it's also deeply recognizable. Most of us have known someone like that Peter. Most of us have probably been like that Peter at some point. The second image is the Peter of Season 8 and beyond. This Peter is something else entirely. His intelligence, already not formidable, has cratered to a level that no longer reads as charming stupidity, but as something closer to genuine incapacity. He is not just unaware of consequences anymore. He seems incapable of empathy at a fundamental level. He does things that are actively cruel, not through obliviousness, but through a kind of gleeful selfishness that the original character never had. He doesn't feel bad when he hurts people. He laughs when his daughter tells him he's a terrible father. He pushes his wife off a boat and into what he believes to be shark-infested water and then flees to save himself. He steals candy from his own infant son. He sabotages his friends' marriages out of petty jealousy. The list of things that later seasons Peter does, laid out without context, reads like a catalog of sociopathic behavior. And the show presents all of it as comedy, which would be fine. Dark comedy can certainly explore these territories, except that the early show established these exact behaviors as the kinds of things that were supposed to upset Peter, the kinds of things he would feel guilt about and try to correct. The later show doesn't just have Peter doing worse things. It has erased the part of him that was troubled by doing wrong. It has taken away his conscience, and in doing so has taken away his character. The transformation happened gradually, across multiple seasons. In Season 4, as noted, the first small pushes toward a meaner Peter were detectable. In Seasons 5, 6, and 7, those pushes became more consistent. But the season that most critics and fans point to as the moment the Flanderization became essentially complete is Season 8, which aired in 2009 and 2010. This is the season where the writing staff seemed to collectively decide that there were no longer any limits on how far Peter could be taken in the direction of cruelty, and where the show's relationship with the concept of consequences for his behavior essentially dissolved. The episode Baby Not on Board, from Season 8, features a storyline where Peter abandons his infant child at a rest stop and doesn't notice for an extended period. The episode Quagmire's Baby features Peter being so disruptive and reckless that he creates genuine harm for people around him without any of the show's usual structures of accountability. And in the broader texture of the season, Peter has simply become a different person, more volatile, more selfish, less capable of genuine connection, less interesting as a result. There is a moment in Season 10, in an episode called Seahorse Seashell Party, that illuminates the problem with devastating clarity. The episode puts the Griffins together in their house during a hurricane, which means no one can leave, which means the tensions that usually exist off-screen have to play out directly. Meg, who by this point has been the target of the family's collective contempt for multiple seasons, finally reaches her breaking point and confronts them. She turns to Peter specifically and delivers a speech that catalogs exactly what he has done to her: the cruelty, the physical humiliation, the neglect, the active wish that she didn't exist. She describes him as completely selfish and totally irresponsible. She calls out the specific things he has done that, in the real world, would have constituted abuse. And here is the thing that makes this moment so significant. Everything she says is true, not dramatically exaggerated. Not the product of a teenager being unfair to a parent who meant well. True. Every behavior she names is something that has been depicted on the show. And Peter's response to hearing this accurate description of himself delivered by his own daughter with obvious pain is to laugh. Not to feel hurt, not to register shame, not to see himself in what she's saying and feel the weight of it. He laughs. The original Peter Griffin would not have laughed. He might have been confused, because early Peter was genuinely not great at understanding how his actions affected other people. He might have gotten defensive initially, but somewhere in the scene, something would have landed. Something would have reached the part of him that actually loved his daughter. The later Peter doesn't have that part anymore. The Flanderization is so complete by this point that the writing has literally had to construct a scene around the character explaining exactly what he's become, because the only way to acknowledge it is to have another character say it out loud. The tragedy of this transformation is that it didn't have to happen. There is nothing in the premise of the show, nothing in the concept of who Peter Griffin was at the beginning, that required him to become this person. The early seasons demonstrated clearly that you could do almost endless comedy with a stupid, well-meaning dad who loved his family and kept making everything worse through no ill intent. You can run that premise for many, many years without having to take the character somewhere dark and cruel. The decision to take Peter in that direction was a creative choice, made by specific people at a specific time, and it was the wrong choice in the most fundamental way. It made the protagonist of the show someone you didn't want to spend time with. Fans noticed. The discourse around Peter Griffin shifted over the years from affectionate frustration, the "Oh Peter, you lovable idiot" energy that the original character generated, to something more like genuine dislike. People who had grown up watching Peter Griffin as one of their favorite cartoon characters started saying they found him hard to watch. Not because he was edgy or transgressive, but because he had become genuinely unpleasant to be around. And when the main character of your show is someone the audience doesn't want to spend time with, you have a structural problem that no amount of clever writing can fully repair. The physical comedy escalated in parallel with the character decay. In the early seasons, Family Guy's physical gags were in the tradition of cartoon violence, exaggerated, consequence-free, and therefore safely funny. Characters got hurt in ways that were clearly impossible and immediately recovered. Nobody in the audience was meant to take it seriously because it wasn't serious. But starting around season 8 and accelerating through the following years, the violence in the show became more detailed, more graphic, and more disturbingly realistic in its depiction. Injuries were shown in close-up, blood was more present, the physical harm being done to characters, by Peter and to others, crossed a threshold from cartoon slapstick into something that felt designed not to be funny but to be genuinely uncomfortable. This is one of the signatures of shock value over dark comedy. The desire not to make you laugh at something uncomfortable, but to make you wince, and then to frame the wincing as the point. Real dark comedy makes you laugh despite the discomfort, or sometimes because of it. Shock value makes you uncomfortable and then waits for you to decide that the discomfort itself is the entertainment. Most audiences, over time, don't find that satisfying. They find it wearing. Peter's relationships with the people around him degraded in step with his character. His friendship with Cleveland, Joe, and Quagmire had been one of the show's reliable sources of warmth. 4 men who genuinely liked each other and looked out for each other even when they were getting into increasingly ridiculous trouble together. That warmth evaporated. The friendships became transactional and occasionally toxic. Joe, who had been introduced in season 1 as the cool new neighbor that everyone admired, wheelchair-bound but tough, capable, and respected, slowly became the butt of increasingly cruel jokes about his disability. His transformation from admired character to comedic target mirrored what was happening to Meg, and it reflected the same underlying shift in the show's sensibility. The discovery that cruelty generates a reaction, and the subsequent decision to prioritize that reaction over the dignity of the characters. His friendship with Brian also changed in ways that were painful to watch for anyone who had followed the show from the beginning. The original Peter and Brian relationship had a particular warmth to it. The smart dog who loved the dumb man for reasons that went beyond logic, and the dumb man who somehow knew, at some level, that Brian was the best thing in his house. That mutual affection underpinned every scene they shared. In the later seasons, as Brian's character underwent its own separate and equally damaging transformation, the relationship lost that warmth. They still hung out. They were still nominally best friends. But the sense that they genuinely loved each other had been replaced by something more like comfortable habit. The relationship between Peter and Lois, which had been the emotional spine of the original show, became something quite different in the Flanderization era. The early show had real love at its center, clumsy, sometimes infuriating love, but genuine. Peter's idiocy was funny because you knew he would eventually come back to Lois and mean it when he apologized. Their dynamic had the specific texture of a real long marriage. The frustration, the eye-rolling, the moments of genuine connection that made the frustration bearable. In the later seasons, that dynamic hardened. Peter became genuinely cruel to Lois in ways that the original character never was. He dismissed her, insulted her, pursued other interests with an indifference to her feelings that went beyond lovable obliviousness into something more like actual contempt. The marriage that had been the show's heart became a showcase for the very same callousness that was destroying every other relationship in the Griffin household. Peter's friendship group also tells the story of his character decline in a way that's worth examining carefully. In the early seasons, the drunken clam scenes Peter with Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire were genuinely warm. Four men who liked each other, giving each other a hard time in the way that men who genuinely trust each other do. There was affection in the ribbing. There was loyalty underneath the jokes. When one of them was in trouble, the others showed up. When Cleveland's marriage fell apart, Peter was there. When Joe was struggling with his disability, the group rallied around him in their imperfect way. These men were friends in the real sense of the word. By the later seasons, what remained of those friendships was hollowed out. The warmth was gone. The dynamic became about who could be the butt of the joke rather than who could make the other laugh. Quagmire, whose character had always been morally compromised in his treatment of women, became more frequently the voice of criticism toward Peter and Brian, which worked as a plot device but revealed something uncomfortable about the show's moral ecosystem. When the person calling out bad behavior is himself not a good person, the criticism lands differently than it would if a genuinely decent character were making it. The show had eliminated most of its genuinely decent characters in the Flanderization process, leaving a world full of people doing wrong to each other without anyone functioning as a moral anchor. The question of consequences is central to understanding Peter's Flanderization. In the original show, consequences existed, not always immediately, not always proportionally, but the idea that actions had outcomes, that doing wrong would eventually come back around, was present in the structure of the comedy. Episodes typically moved from chaos to resolution, and the resolution usually involved Peter reconing with something he had done. This structure served a function beyond just story mechanics. It communicated that the world of the show had values, that the show itself had a perspective on what Peter was doing. When the consequences disappeared, when Peter's cruelty began to generate either no response or a response that treated it as normal, the show communicated something very different. It communicated that the cruelty was fine. Not funny fine or cartoonishly fine, but actually fine, acceptable, unremarkable. The Flanderization of Peter Griffin is not just the story of one character going wrong. It is the story of a show losing its moral center. In a family comedy, the dad is the axis around which everything else rotates. When that axis is warm, the whole show is warm. When that axis is cold and cruel, the whole show takes on that coldness. Everything that happened to the other characters over the course of Family Guy's decline is connected to what happened to Peter, because Peter is the thing at the center of the story. And once the center went wrong, nothing else was ever quite right again. Section 5. Brian Griffin from voice of reason to audience frustration. If what happened to Peter Griffin was the story of a character going from lovable to unlikable, what happened to Brian Griffin is something subtly different and in some ways even more painful. Peter's decline was a kind of exaggeration, taking traits that were already present, selfishness, recklessness, emotional obliviousness, and amplifying them past the point where they could be redeemed by good intentions. Brian's decline was more like a betrayal. He was the character the audience trusted most. He was the one who was supposed to understand things. He was the measure by which the chaos of the Griffin household was understood to be funny rather than just chaotic. And the writers took that character and turned him into something that many fans, by the later seasons, actively dreaded seeing on screen. In the original 3 seasons, Brian Griffin was doing something genuinely impressive in the architecture of the show. He was the voice of reason without being the moral police. He was intelligent without being smug. He had real flaws: the drinking, the failed literary ambitions, the unrequited feelings for Lois, but those flaws were balanced by qualities that made him worth rooting for. He was loyal. He was funny in a dry, observational way that complemented rather than competed with the broader comedy around him. He was the character who felt most like a real person, which is a strange thing to say about a talking dog, but it was true. When Brian was sad, you felt it. When Brian was happy, you were glad for him. He had emotional stakes that felt genuine. His friendship with Stewie, which became increasingly central to the show in the revival era, worked because it was built on a genuine creative tension. Stewie was extraordinary, volatile, brilliant, unpredictable. Brian was grounded, measured, wry, aware. Together they generated a dynamic that the show hadn't had before. 2 very different people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who challenged each other, who were better together than apart. The Road 2 episodes, which were essentially extended adventures where the 2 of them traveled together and had to navigate increasingly absurd situations, were among the most consistently well-received things the revival produced. They were proof that Family Guy could do something more than string gags together. It could build a relationship that you genuinely cared about. But the writers couldn't seem to leave well enough alone. The political commentary that Brian had always offered as one ingredient among many started, as we've noted, to take on more weight from Season 4 onward. By Season 7 and into Season 8, there were episodes where Brian's political views weren't just a character trait, but the actual point of the episode, where the storyline existed primarily to allow Brian to deliver a perspective on some contemporary issue, and where the quality of the comedy was essentially secondary to the message. The problem with this approach is not the politics themselves. Family Guy had always been politically engaged and had always leaned in particular directions. The problem was the substitution of a character delivering arguments for a character doing things. Brian stopped being funny about his politics and started being correct about his politics, which is a much less entertaining thing to watch. This was connected to a broader problem with Brian's character in the later seasons. He became a fraud. The early Brian had genuine intellectual qualities. He had read the books he talked about. He had opinions that were grounded in actual engagement with ideas. His literary failures were poignant because you could see that the talent was real, even if it wasn't quite sufficient for the ambitions he had. The later Brian was performing intelligence without having it. He talked endlessly about being a great writer while producing work that was revealed, when anyone actually engaged with it, to be terrible. He positioned himself as morally superior to the people around him while doing things that were worse than most of what they did. He was, in the specific technical sense of the word, a hypocrite, someone whose public presentation of themselves was entirely disconnected from their actual behavior. The episode that most fans point to as the moment Brian became genuinely unbearable is Brian Writes a Bestseller from Season 9. The premise is that Stewie encourages Brian to get back to writing, and Brian responds by producing a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It, which somehow becomes enormously popular. Success in this episode transforms Brian into something monstrous. He becomes arrogant in a specific way, not the performative arrogance of someone who knows they're being foolish, but the genuine arrogance of someone who believes they deserve everything good that's happened to them, and nothing bad. He treats Stewie, the one who believed in him and pushed him to start writing again, with contempt. He is dismissive, cruel, and utterly incapable of gratitude. What makes this episode particularly significant is that it marks the point where Brian's negative traits stopped being the flaws of a complicated but basically good character and started being the dominant qualities of a genuinely bad one. In the episodes that followed, the pattern established in Brian Writes a Bestseller kept reasserting itself. Brian would receive good fortune through someone else's efforts, respond with selfishness, and face minimal consequences. Brian would be caught in hypocrisy, acknowledge it briefly, and then return to the same hypocritical behavior without apparent awareness. The character had lost the capacity for growth that had made him worth following. A particularly damaging set of behaviors in the later seasons involves Brian's relationships with other people and what those relationships reveal about who he had become. In one episode, he finds a woman trapped in a car that is about to fall into water. He begins to help her. Then he discovers that she has a child, indicating that she is likely in a relationship, and he releases her. He lets an innocent person drown because she was not available to date. This is presented as a joke. The show invites you to find it funny that Brian's romantic disappointment is more important to him than a stranger's life. It is one of the clearest examples of the show using shock as a substitute for comedy. The action is extreme enough to generate a reaction, but there is no wit in it, no intelligence, no reason to laugh except the pure surprise of how far the writers were willing to go. There is also the matter of the Jerome is the New Black episode from season 8, in which Quagmire, not historically, a character with great moral standing, delivers what has become one of the most discussed monologues in the show's history. Quagmire sits Brian down and explains, in detailed and completely accurate terms, why he dislikes him. He catalogs Brian's hypocrisy, his failures, his dishonesty, his bad behavior toward Peter, toward women, toward everyone who has ever been foolish enough to trust him. Every single item in Quagmire's indictment is backed by things the show has actually depicted. It is essentially the writers acknowledging through Quagmire everything that the audience had been thinking about Brian for several seasons. This moment is fascinating precisely because of what it did and didn't change. The writers clearly knew what Brian had become. They clearly understood at some level that his transformation from voice of reason to insufferable fraud had not gone unnoticed. They used Quagmire to say everything the audience was thinking, and in doing so appeared to be setting up a turning point, a moment from which Brian would reckon with himself and begin to change. And then nothing changed. Brian's behavior in the episodes following that monologue was essentially unchanged. If anything, his antagonism toward Quagmire intensified in subsequent seasons, with Brian deliberately targeting Quagmire in increasingly petty and elaborate ways that made him look worse, not better. The show had used its awareness of Brian's decline as a joke, rather than as a starting point for actual character development. It had acknowledged the problem and then immediately chosen not to address it. Then came November of 2013 and the episode called Life of Brian. In this episode, Brian Griffin is struck by a car and killed. The family grieves. A new dog named Vinny is introduced. The show appeared, for a moment, to be doing something genuinely bold, acknowledging that its most prominent character had become a liability, and writing him out in a way that would allow the story to move in a new direction. The reaction was enormous. Petitions were created demanding Brian's return. Social media exploded with criticism and grief in equal measure. The death of Brian Griffin trended nationally. Seth MacFarlane himself later said that the team was genuinely surprised by the intensity of the fan reaction, noting that they were taken aback that people still cared enough about the character to be that angry. Then, just 2 episodes later, barely 3 weeks of airtime, Stewie used a time travel device to go back and prevent Brian from being hit by the car. Brian came back, everything reset. The death that had appeared to be a meaningful narrative event was revealed to have been a rating stunt, executed without any genuine commitment to its implications, and reversed the moment it had served its purpose of generating attention. This moment is, in retrospect, one of the clearest illustrations of what Family Guy had become by this point in its run. Not a show that made creative decisions in service of its stories and characters, but a show that made decisions in service of its continued visibility in an increasingly crowded media landscape. The death of Brian Griffin was not storytelling, it was marketing. And the almost immediate reversal of it confirmed that the show's creators understood this, that there was no actual desire to explore what the story required, only a desire to generate the maximum possible reaction with the minimum possible commitment. There are moments, scattered throughout the later seasons, where flashes of the original Brian appear. Episodes where he does something genuinely selfless, where his affection for Stewie is palpable and real, where his intelligence seems to come from actual knowledge rather than performance. These moments are painful in their own way, because they demonstrate that the writers knew who Brian was supposed to be. They had not forgotten. They were just choosing, most of the time, not to write him that way. And the gap between the character they remembered and the character they were writing is the measure of how far the show had drifted from what made it worth watching. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge what Brian Griffin's original character meant to people who connected with it. He wasn't just a funny talking dog. He was a specific kind of character that people recognized themselves in. The person who was a little too intelligent for where they found themselves, the one who wanted to be taken seriously but kept getting in their own way, the one who was capable of deep loyalty but also capable of the specific self-destruction that comes with thinking too much about yourself. He had failures that felt real because they were rooted in real human psychology, the failed writer syndrome, the romantic idealism that kept colliding with reality, the gap between the person you believe yourself to be and the person you actually are. When the show turned Brian into a caricature of these qualities, exaggerating the pretension while eliminating the genuine intelligence, keeping the romantic idealism while removing the actual capacity for love, maintaining the posture of moral superiority while making his actual behavior systematically worse than anyone he criticized, it didn't just change a character. It destroyed an archetype. It took a version of a recognizable human experience and replaced it with a mockery of that experience. And people who had seen themselves in the original Brian found themselves being mocked by the replacement. That's a specific kind of betrayal that goes beyond ordinary creative missteps. Section 6. The Stewie Problem: Losing the Evil Genius. Every generation of television viewers has that one character who defines what they remember about a show. The character who gets quoted. The character who ends up on merchandise they actually buy. The character who they try to do the voice of, with varying success, at parties and in classrooms and in the spaces between ordinary life, where something truly funny gets pulled out and shared. For an enormous number of people who watched Family Guy in the early 2000s, that character was Stewie Griffin. The evil genius baby was not merely funny, he was genuinely original. In the history of animated television, in the history of television generally, there had never been a character quite like him. A 1-year-old, an actual infant in a diaper, sitting in a high chair, being fed his lunch, speaking with the crisp, measured diction of a classically trained British villain, describing his latest scheme to eliminate his mother with the same casual precision that a person might use to describe a grocery list, building laser guns in his nursery, programming time machines while wearing his yellow onesie, discussing the tactical challenges of world domination while Lois changed his diaper and heard only the contented sounds of a happy baby. The comedy was layered in a way that takes a moment to fully appreciate. On the surface, the gap between what Stewie looked like and what Stewie was saying was funny. The contrast was obvious and immediate. But underneath that surface joke was something more interesting. The question of whether any of it was real, and what it would mean about the world of the show if it was. The adults couldn't hear him, or at least most of them couldn't, which meant Stewie was performing his menace into a void, which gave every scene with him a quality of elegant absurdity. Here was this creature of genuine darkness, this credible threat who could back up his grandiose claims with real technology and real capability, and nobody in his immediate environment knew it. Only the audience knew it. Only Brian knew it. And the private knowledge was part of the pleasure. The decision to retire this character, because that is, essentially, what happened, was made gradually and never formally announced, but it was clearly intentional. The writers and MacFarlane himself have spoken about feeling that the evil genius baby concept had been exhausted, that they had explored every angle they could think of, and that continuing to do the same thing would make the character feel stale. Starting in Season 4, Stewie's personality began its slow pivot. The world domination plots became less frequent. The attempts on Lois's life became episodic rather than continuous. The weapons and machines appeared less often. In their place, a new emotional landscape emerged for Stewie, one defined by his growing friendship with Brian, by questions of identity, by the kinds of insecurities that feel more age-appropriate for a thoughtful child than for a would-be dictator. By Season 8, the transformation was essentially complete. The Stewie who existed in those episodes and in all the seasons that followed was a fundamentally different character from the one who had made the show famous. He was still entertaining. He was still voiced by MacFarlane with remarkable skill and commitment. He still had his British accent and his occasional flashes of competence and his deep, genuine love for Brian. But the specific quality that had made him irreplaceable, the combination of intellectual menace and physical helplessness, The dark joke of a baby who was genuinely terrifying was gone. In its place was a character who was emotionally accessible, frequently funny, and thoroughly ordinary by the standards of animated comedy. The Season 6 two-parter, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, functions in retrospect as something like a formal farewell to the original version of the character. The episodes gave Stewie everything he had been building towards since the pilot. He fulfilled his mission. He killed Lois. He took over the world. He stood in the position he had always wanted to stand in, and then the show pulled the rug out with the simulation twist, and after that, the evil plots essentially stopped. The character who had defined the show's most original impulse had achieved his dream in a dream, which is the cruelest possible way to retire a concept. What makes the choice particularly difficult to defend in retrospect is the timeline. The argument that the evil genius baby joke had been exhausted was made in support of a transition that happened around season 4 or 5. Family Guy has now produced, as of the time of writing, more than 20 seasons with the softer, gentler version of Stewie than it ever produced with the original. If the writers could sustain the character for 20-plus years in his updated form, it is genuinely hard to understand why they couldn't have found more material for the original. The evil genius baby concept was not a one-trick premise. It was a platform, an intelligent, ambitious, technically capable infant who wanted to conquer civilization could do an essentially unlimited number of interesting things. New inventions, new schemes, new targets beyond just Lois, new adversaries. The technology could get bigger and stranger. The schemes could become more elaborate. The specific texture of the comedy, that beautiful contrast between what he looked like and what he was, never had to get old, because what he was could keep changing even as what he looked like stayed the same. The softer Stewie is not a bad character. He has given the show genuine emotional moments that the original version could never have accessed. The episode Christmas Guy, where Stewie uses time travel to save Brian's life after Brian's death in season 12, is emotionally affecting in a way that depends entirely on the audience caring about the relationship Stewie and Brian have built over years of adventures together. That episode could not have existed with the original Stewie, because the original Stewie would not have loved Brian the way the later Stewie does. There is a real argument that the character has depth now that he didn't have in the first 3 seasons, and it would be dishonest to dismiss that entirely. But the counter-argument is not about whether the new Stewie is good. It's about whether what was gained was worth what was lost. The new Stewie is good. The original Stewie was extraordinary, and there are many characters in animation who are emotionally complex, self-aware, capable of warmth and vulnerability. There was only one evil genius baby. There was only one character in the history of the medium who was doing what Stewie did in those first 3 seasons, and the writers retired him not because they had to, but because they ran out of immediate ideas, which is not the same thing. The later seasons made various attempts to revisit the original Stewie in small ways. In season 23, there were episodes that played with the idea of Stewie returning to some version of his scheming, plotting self. But these moments always felt like guest appearances by a character who no longer really lived in the show, rather than genuine expressions of who the character was. The original Stewie existed within a specific creative ecosystem. The show needed him to be dangerous, to be funny in the way he was funny, and the show had long since decided that danger wasn't the kind of thing it wanted to do anymore. Section 7. Meg as a punching bag. The joke that went too far. There is a particular kind of discomfort that comes from watching a show you used to love do something to one of its characters that you can't quite explain away or laugh off. Not because it's too edgy or too dark, but because it reveals something about the show's values that sits badly with you long after the episode has ended. The treatment of Meg Griffin over roughly 10 seasons of Family Guy produces exactly that discomfort, and the reason it sits so badly is not simply that it was cruel. Comedy can be cruel in productive ways, but that it was purposeless. The cruelty served nothing except itself. Meg Griffin was introduced in the pilot as Peter and Lois's oldest daughter. In season 1, she was voiced by Lacey Chabert. From season 2 onward, the role was taken over by Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg ever since. The original concept for Meg was clear and reasonably well defined. She was the ordinary one. In a family that included a reckless idiot father, a long-suffering but fundamentally extraordinary mother, a clueless but oddly charming brother, a secretly evil genius baby, and a talking dog, The normal teenage girl was naturally going to seem a little dull by comparison, and that contrast was the joke. Meg was the benchmark of normalcy against which everyone else's strangeness was measured. She was the audience's point of entry into a world that was otherwise quite far from anything resembling ordinary life. In those first 3 seasons, this premise generated gentle, sometimes genuinely touching comedy. Meg's storylines were about the specific indignities of being ordinary in an extraordinary family, about wanting more than you're getting, about not knowing how to claim the attention you deserve, about the particular invisibility of being the teenager in a house full of people who are all, in their own ways, more interesting than you feel. These are universal experiences. They're real in a way that the show's more fantastical elements weren't, and Meg being the grounded, relatable one, while her family flew off in increasingly strange directions, gave the audience something to hold on to. The shift began, as so many of the show's shifts did, in season 4. And it began with the specific decision to move Meg's comedic function from being the ordinary one to being the undesirable one. This is a crucial distinction. Being ordinary is a condition that anyone can inhabit and most people have inhabited. It generates sympathy alongside the comedy because the audience recognizes the experience. Being undesirable, being actively ugly, unwanted, and deserving of rejection is a different kind of comedy, and it's a much crueler one, because it's not rooted in recognition but in contempt. Characters began commenting on Meg's appearance with increasing directness. Peter started making comments about his daughter's looks that, even in the context of a comedy, were hard to hear. The show started staging scenes where other characters recoiled from Meg physically, where the joke was the specific awfulness of her being who she was. And this escalated, season by season, episode by episode, in the specific way that things escalate when a show discovers that cruelty gets a reaction and starts measuring its success by the intensity of the reaction rather than the quality of the comedy it's producing. By seasons 8 through 12, the treatment of Meg had become one of the defining features of the entire show, something people mentioned when they talked about what made Family Guy hard to watch in its later years. Peter wasn't just making insensitive comments anymore. He was farting in his daughter's face as entertainment. He was physically shoving her. He was making explicit, direct statements about wishing she didn't exist. A flashback sequence revealed that he and Lois had once tried to abandon infant Meg at a fire station, the joke being that her own parents had tried to throw her away before she could walk. This was presented as comedy. The audience was invited to laugh at it. The entire family had, by this point, united around the project of making Meg miserable. Lois, who in the early seasons had been the patient, caring mother, the one person in the family who could be counted on to treat Meg with basic dignity, had taken on a coldness toward her daughter that was specifically uncomfortable because of how the character had started. Chris, who used to have a normal sibling relationship with Meg, participated in the bullying. Stewie delivered casual cruelty her way, despite barely interacting with her in the original run. The household had achieved a kind of unanimous contempt for one of its members that read, in the context of a show that was supposed to be about a family who loved each other, as something genuinely disturbing. The world outside the family was no different. Meg's experience at school involved sustained, relentless bullying from her classmates. Teachers mistreated her. Strangers commented on her with hostility. The entire fictional world of the show had apparently agreed that Meg Griffin deserved to be treated badly, and nobody in that world was going to question it or offer her anything different. The real-world consequences of this eventually became visible in a particularly striking way. Mila Kunis, the actress who voices Meg, has spoken publicly about the effect of the character's treatment on her own experience. She described situations where people would approach her in real life and recite the catchphrase associated with Meg's abuse, the dismissive, cruel thing that Peter says to silence her to her face, as if the fictional cruelty were an appropriate way to interact with the real woman who gave the character her voice. The fictional violence had been so successfully normalized by the show that it had bled into the way real people felt comfortable behaving. Then came the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, which is almost certainly the most controversial episode in the entire Meg storyline and possibly in the show's history. The setup is deceptively straightforward. The family is trapped in their house during a hurricane. Meg, who has been enduring the accumulated weight of years of the treatment described above, finally breaks. She confronts her family. She tells Peter that he's a terrible father. She tells Lois that she's a bad mother. She lays out, with raw specificity, exactly how the way they have treated her has affected her entire life. It is a powerful, raw, genuinely well-written moment. For viewers who had been watching Meg endure season after season of abuse, it felt like justice arriving. It felt like the show finally acknowledging the reality of what it had been doing. And then the episode turned. After Meg's confrontation, the family falls apart. Without Meg as the shared target for their frustrations, Peter, Lois, Brian, and Chris turn on each other. The episode reveals that Meg has been serving as a kind of emotional shock absorber for the family, that her willingness to be the punching bag has been preventing all the other family members from directing their misery at each other. And the episode ends with Meg going to Brian and voluntarily taking back everything she said. She accepts that her role is to absorb the family's dysfunction so that everyone else can function. She agrees to go back to being the target because without her in that role, the family doesn't work. The message of that ending is worth sitting with. It tells the audience that victims of abuse should accept their role because their suffering keeps things stable for others. It says that standing up for yourself is a selfish act because it disrupts the people who are hurting you. It says that the right response to years of mistreatment is to quietly return to being mistreated so that nobody else has to face uncomfortable consequences. Whether this was intentional or not, and it's genuinely not clear how much the writers thought through what they were saying, the episode communicates this with striking clarity. Fans were furious. The episode consistently ranks among the most hated in the show's entire run, not because it was badly made in a technical sense. The writing and the confrontation scene is actually quite good, but because of the choice it made. It had the capacity for something genuinely meaningful and chose to use that capacity to send a message about abuse that was troubling at best and actively harmful at worst. What makes everything surrounding Meg even more frustrating is the intermittent evidence that the show knew how to write her well. There are episodes, particularly later in the show's run, where Meg is treated like an actual character with actual qualities, rather than a target. A crossover episode with The Simpsons has Meg meeting Lisa Simpson, who sees her, encourages her, and helps her discover that she has real musical talent. It's warm and specific, and treats Meg with the basic dignity that years of the show had withheld from her. An episode called Peter's Sister in Season 14 attempts to explain the cycle of abuse by showing that Peter himself was abused by his own sister as a child, and showing Meg responding to that knowledge with compassion rather than resentment. Peter acknowledges what he's done to her. They reconcile. It's a genuinely strong episode that gives both characters real depth. And then the very next episode, it's gone. The reconciliation didn't happen. The insight Peter gained never stuck. Meg is back at the bottom of the pile. The reset button was hit, as it always gets hit in Family Guy, and everything that had been learned or felt or changed was erased as if it had never occurred. This reset mentality, the show's fundamental inability to let anything that matters stick, is the thread connecting the Meg storyline to everything else we've discussed about the show's decline. The characters can't grow because the show won't let them grow. Every time they reach the edge of genuine change, the writers pull them back to where they started. And after enough cycles of reach and retract, the audience stops caring whether anything significant will actually happen, because they've learned, through experience, that it won't. The irony of the whole Meg situation, which isn't lost on anyone who has watched the show carefully, is that she might actually be the most sympathetic and most human person in the Griffin family. Her desires are simple and universal. She wants her parents to be proud of her. She wants to feel loved. She wants to belong somewhere. These are not complicated or unusual things to want. They are the baseline things that almost every person wants. And the show, for roughly 10 seasons, chose to punish her relentlessly for having them, framing her basic human needs as evidence that she deserved what she was getting. That's not dark comedy. That's something else. And the show's gradual, partial recognition of this, the pulling back on Meg's abuse in later seasons, the episodes that finally treat her as a person is welcome, but it can't undo what was done. The recovery of Meg in the show's more recent seasons, and the recovery is real, even if it arrived a decade too late, is worth understanding in context. The writers who began pushing back against the constant cruelty were responding to a room that had changed. The addition of more diverse voices to the Family Guy writing staff, including more women, created institutional pressure against content that the original room had apparently been comfortable producing without much resistance. This is a useful reminder that the specific people in the room matter enormously. The choices that defined the Megabuse era were not abstract or inevitable. They were made by a specific group of people operating with specific assumptions about what was funny and what was acceptable. Different people made different assumptions. The version of Meg that has emerged in the show's more recent seasons, one who fights back, who has competence and resilience, who isn't simply waiting for the next humiliation, is actually a compelling character. She always had the potential to be. The qualities that make her interesting now were present in the original concept. They were just buried under years of decisions that chose contempt over development. And the fact that she's been allowed to emerge in recent seasons suggests that even a show that has drifted as far as Family Guy has can course correct in specific ways when the right people are fighting for the right things. It just took an unconscionably long time. Section 8. Cutaway gags from secret weapon to creative crutch. If you were going to explain Family Guy to someone who had never seen it, you would probably mention the cutaway gag within the first few sentences. It's the thing the show is most famous for, and for good reason. It was genuinely innovative when the show started. A specific comedy tool that had never been deployed quite so precisely or so consistently in an animated context. Understanding what happened to the cutaway gag over the course of the show's run is essential to understanding what happened to Family Guy overall, because the story of the cutaway is, in miniature, the story of everything else. The mechanics of the cutaway are simple. A character in the main scene says something that references a prior event or makes a comparison. The screen cuts away to a brief, usually absurd vignette illustrating that reference. The vignette plays out. The screen cuts back. The main scene continues. In and of itself, this is just a structural technique, neither good nor bad. What determined whether it was good or bad was always the specific quality of the execution, the wit of the setup, the creativity of the vignette, and crucially, the relationship between the cutaway and the episode around it. In the first 3 seasons, that relationship was one of supplementation. The cutaways existed alongside strong plots and strong character work. An episode had a real story. Something was happening to the Griffins. There was a complication. There was a resolution. The characters were revealed in the way characters are revealed through action and consequence. The cutaways were bonuses within that structure, small gifts of absurdity that arrived and departed without disrupting the main event. They were, as the transcript puts it perfectly, the cherry on top of something that was already working. Remove the cutaways from a Season 2 episode and you still had a satisfying, funny, complete piece of television. This was the creative achievement of the early show that is easiest to underestimate because it looks, from the outside, like the simplest thing Family Guy did. Actually, it was the hardest thing. Maintaining a real story with real structure and real character work, while also deploying frequent, creative, often brilliant comic tangents without losing the thread. That balance requires discipline and craft. It requires the writers to value the story as much as they value the gags, which in turn requires institutional support for that value at every level of production. That institutional support began to erode in Season 4 and continued to erode in every subsequent season. The cutaways got longer. They appeared more frequently. The plots of episodes began to thin out to accommodate them, then thinned out to the point where they were barely present. A template emerged in the mid-run seasons of the show. Establish the premise of the episode in a brief opening. Deliver a cutaway. Return to the premise briefly. Deliver another cutaway. Repeat until the episode's runtime was filled. Resolve the premise as quickly as possible in the final few minutes. Some later episodes, if you removed all the cutaways, would have maybe 8 to 10 minutes of actual story content in a 22-minute episode. The South Park episode Cartoon Wars, which aired in 2006 during Family Guy's 5th season, made this critique with devastating precision by depicting Family Guy's jokes as being randomly generated by manatees, pushing idea balls together into combinations. The premise of the bit was that the cutaways had no logical or creative connection to anything, that they were genuinely interchangeable, that you could put any Family Guy cutaway in any Family Guy episode and nothing would be different because the cutaways existed completely independent of the stories they were supposedly illustrating. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who created South Park, have been openly contemptuous of Family Guy's writing style in multiple interviews, and the Manatee bit expressed their criticism in comedic form. Whether you find their criticism fair or not, and there is a legitimate counterargument that Family Guy's specific brand of randomness is a deliberate aesthetic choice rather than a failure of craft the later. Seasons of Family Guy effectively proved their point. The cutaways in Season 1 were specific. They grew out of particular moments, in particular episodes, and illustrated something particular about the characters or the situation. The cutaways in Season 16 were not specific. They could, with minimal adjustment, have appeared in any other episode of the same era. The randomness had become genuine randomness rather than the simulated randomness of carefully crafted surrealism. The Conway Twitty gag, which appeared multiple times across several seasons, became the most infamous example of this problem. Conway Twitty was a country music singer active from the late 1950s through the early 1990s, and the Family Guy gag consisted of simply cutting away from the main episode to show a full, uninterrupted Conway Twitty performance. Not a brief clip, not a reference, a full song. The joke, if there was one, was that the show had simply replaced its comedic content with a country song, and you could either find that funny or simply wait for it to end. The first occurrence was surprising enough to generate a reaction. By the third and fourth time, it was almost universally cited as one of the most nakedly lazy things the show ever put on television. Not dark, not transgressive, just an extended void where the comedy was supposed to be. The Conway Twitty gag became a symbol precisely because it made explicit what the extended, dragged-out, low-effort cutaways of the later seasons were doing more covertly. They were occupying time. They were filling the 22-minute runtime without actually doing anything. They were the writer's acknowledgement, made in a code that most viewers decoded correctly, that they didn't have enough material to fill an episode the honest way. The physical joke dragged past the point of comedy became another manifestation of the same problem. In the original seasons, physical gags were brief. A character fell, got hurt, made a face, and the scene moved on. In the revival seasons, the same physical gag would be extended to extraordinary lengths, Peter injuring his knee, for example, and sitting on the floor making the same sound of pain for 45 seconds while the camera held on him and the scene went nowhere. The theory, apparently, was that extending a joke long enough would transform it through sheer commitment that what had been merely amusing for 5 seconds would become hilarious at 30 seconds. Occasionally this worked. Mostly it just revealed how little was actually happening in the scene. The show's self-awareness about its own cutaway dependency was interesting and ultimately futile. The episode Back to the Pilot, from Season 10, features Brian and Stewie traveling back in time to the first episode of the show, where they observe the characters standing in awkward silence during a cutaway, just waiting for it to end. The joke is that the cutaways take the characters out of the story and leave them with nothing to do. It's funny as a piece of meta-commentary, but it's also a confession. The show knew the problem existed. It was making a joke about it rather than solving it. The most striking proof that cutaways were a symptom of the show's problems, rather than an inherent aspect of the form, is the episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8, universally praised, consistently ranked among the best episodes the show ever made, in which Brian and Stewie are locked in a bank vault overnight and spend the entire episode simply talking to each other. There are no cutaways. There are no random tangents. It is 22 minutes of two characters having honest, sometimes painful, deeply revealing conversations about their lives, their friendship, and their deepest fears. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has thought about ending his own life. Stewie reveals how much Brian means to him. It is by some distance the most emotionally resonant thing Family Guy has ever produced, and it achieves that resonance through nothing more than two well-written characters and the courage to stay in a scene long enough for it to matter. The existence of Brian and Stewie proves conclusively that Family Guy didn't need cutaways to be excellent. It needed good writing and the institutional willingness to prioritize story and character over the production of individually viral moments. The fact that that episode stands out as exceptional rather than representative tells you everything about the choices the show made in its extended run. The connection between cutaway overload and the character problems documented throughout this narrative is direct and causal. When a show spends most of its runtime on disconnected tangents, it has less time to develop the people at its center, less time for meaningful dialogue, less time for the Griffins to exist together in the same room and reveal who they are to each other and to the audience through action and reaction. The early show's warmth, the sense that this family, for all their chaos, genuinely loved each other, required the space that extended storytelling creates. You can't build that warmth in the 30 seconds between one cutaway and the next. You need scenes that breathe, characters who have room to be complicated, stories that have enough time to reach something real before they end. The cutaways didn't just replace the comedy. They replaced the heart. And without the heart, there was nothing to make the audience care about what happened to the characters in the spaces between the gags. The internet dimension of the cutaway problem is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it helps explain why the institutional incentives kept pushing the show in this direction even as the creative costs mounted. Family Guy's clips were, for many years, among the most watched video content on YouTube. Individual cutaways, ripped from episodes and uploaded separately, would accumulate tens or hundreds of millions of views. These numbers told a certain story to the people who made decisions about the show. The cutaways were what people wanted. The cutaways were what people were watching. The surrounding episode might have thinned out to almost nothing, but the cutaways kept pulling numbers. What this metric missed is the difference between watching a clip and watching a show. The people watching individual Family Guy clips on YouTube in the 2010s were not, for the most part, the same people who had loved Family Guy in the 2000s. They were discovering individual moments without the context of caring about the characters or the world those moments came from. The clip culture around Family Guy was real, but it was a different kind of engagement from the engagement that had made the show great. It was consumption without investment. It was the specific kind of viral attention that is easy to generate and hard to convert into loyal viewership. And the show's increasing orientation toward that kind of engagement toward producing moments, rather than stories, reflected a fundamental confusion about what had actually made it successful in the first place. The confusion is understandable, in a business sense. If the cutaways are what get the views, make more cutaways. If the individual moments are what people share, make more shareable moments. The logic tracks if you're optimizing for short-term engagement. What it misses is that the moments were only powerful in the first place because they existed within a show that people genuinely cared about. Extract them from that context, and they're just clips. Produce them without that context, and you have a clip factory, not a television show. By the middle of its run, Family Guy had become, in many of its episodes, exactly that. Section 9. The tipping point in detail seasons 8 through 12. The period from season 8 through season 12, roughly 2009 to 2014, is the stretch of Family Guy's run that most critics and engaged fans point to as the moment the show stopped being something that was mostly good with some problems and became something that was mostly problematic with occasional good moments. Not all at once, still gradually. But the accumulation of changes that had been building since the revival reached a critical mass in these years, and the result was a show that was recognizable as Family Guy in surface details while being genuinely different in almost every other respect. Season 8, which aired from 2009 to 2010, is where Peter's Flanderization hit what would become its recognizable modern form. The season contains several episodes that are frequently cited in discussions of the show's worst moments. Moments where the cruelty toward Meg has escalated past anything in the earlier seasons. Moments where Brian's political commentary takes up so much space that it functionally replaces any other character quality. Moments where the violence being depicted is graphic enough that it stops functioning as cartoon comedy and starts functioning as shock content. It is also the season that contains Brian and Stewie, the exceptional episode described above. This is important context. In the same season that contained the show's clearest expressions of what it was becoming at its worst, it also produced one of the finest things it ever made. The talent was still there. The capacity for excellence had not disappeared. What was happening was a growing disparity between the best the show could do and the average of what it was actually doing, with the average drifting further and further from the best. Season 9 produced Brian Writes a Bestseller, which we've already discussed as the episode most frequently identified as the moment Brian became definitively unlikable. It also produced the Jerome is the New Black episode with Quagmire's monologue, which demonstrated that the writers were fully aware of what Brian had become. These two episodes together form an interesting set, one that depicts the character at his worst, and one that names exactly what the character has become while implicitly suggesting that this will be addressed. Neither the depicting nor the naming led to any actual change. Season 10 contained Seahorse Seashell Party and its controversial conclusion for Meg. It also produced the episode Grumpy Old Man, which attempted to give Peter some genuine emotional depth by exploring his relationship with his own mortality. It contained Back to the Pilot, the meta-commentary episode about cutaways. The season was a study in contradictions capable of insight, frequently delivering the opposite of insight and not seeming to register the difference. Seasons 11 and 12 continued in the same vein, with Season 12 providing the Brian death and resurrection that we've discussed at length. The pattern that had established itself was clear. The show would occasionally produce something genuinely good, sometimes something that recalled the quality of the early years, and these exceptions would be surrounded on all sides by episodes that demonstrated the full range of the show's problems. Fans in this period developed a relationship with Family Guy that was less about loving the show and more about hoping that any given episode would be one of the exceptions rather than one of the examples. The show's relationship with real-world topicality shifted in this period in ways that compounded the aging problem. Family Guy had always made cultural references, always engaged with contemporary events and figures. But in the early seasons, the cultural references were usually deployed in service of a timeless joke. The humor didn't depend on knowing the specific context. It just gained an extra dimension if you did. In the later seasons, increasingly, the humor was the specific reference. An episode would be built around mocking a particular cultural moment or public figure in ways that required active, current knowledge of that moment to understand. These episodes aged catastrophically. Watch a Season 10 episode that was topical in 2011 and try to explain the jokes to someone born in 2005. The jokes are the topicality, and the topicality has long since passed. The fourth wall breaking became more aggressive in this period. Characters would address the audience directly. Peter would make jokes about Fox, about the show's declining quality, about the writers. Sometimes this worked the show's self-awareness, when it was genuinely self-aware rather than just defensively self-deprecating, could generate real comedy. But mostly, acknowledging the problems in the show and then immediately returning to the same problems reads as a kind of learned helplessness. A person who says, "I know I keep doing this, I'm terrible," before doing the same destructive thing again is not demonstrating self-awareness. They're demonstrating that awareness, without the willingness to change, is useless. What was most damaging about the seasons 8 through 12 period was what happened to the audience's relationship with the show as a result of all of these cumulative shifts. Television viewers develop what might be called emotional contracts with the shows they watch. These contracts are informal and unstated, but they're real. When you commit to a television show, you are agreeing to care about what happens to the characters and to trust the creators to take those characters somewhere worth going. In return for your attention and investment, the show agrees to treat the things you care about with some level of respect. Family Guy in its early seasons honored that contract. The things the audience cared about the characters' relationships, their specific qualities, the warmth of the family dynamic were treated with care. The show might push against them, might put those things under pressure, but it never abandoned them. By seasons 8 through 12, the show had essentially stopped honoring the contract. The characters the audience had invested in were being systematically changed into versions of themselves that were harder to love. The warmth the audience had signed up for was being replaced with a different texture that many people found alienating. The implicit promise that this was a show about a family who loved each other, even imperfectly, was being broken episode by episode. When a television show breaks its contract with its audience, the response is rarely a sudden dramatic abandonment. It's more often a gradual withdrawal of investment. People keep watching, but they stop caring. They stop talking about it with the same enthusiasm. They stop defending it when someone criticizes it. They start watching it out of habit rather than out of genuine desire. And eventually, the habit runs out of momentum and they drift away entirely. The ratings numbers that decline season after season are not telling the story of people who encountered Family Guy and decided not to watch it. They're telling the story of people who used to love it and slowly stopped feeling the things that love requires. There were flashes of the old magic scattered across these seasons that made the declining trajectory particularly poignant. An episode that suddenly remembered who these characters were and what had made them worth following would arrive and remind the audience of what the show had promised, making the return to the usual approach feel even more like a betrayal than it would have if the exceptional episode hadn't appeared. These moments of excellence in the sea of mediocrity were in some ways worse than consistent mediocrity, because they demonstrated that the problem wasn't inability, it was choice. Section 10. Seth MacFarlane steps back. The creator leaves his creation. The pattern of creators stepping away from their creations and the subsequent consequences for those creations is one of the most consistent stories in television history. It plays out again and again across genres and formats and eras. A person builds something that bears their specific creative fingerprint, and then other projects and other opportunities and the simple mathematics of time pull them away from it, and the thing they built begins to drift in the absence of their specific steering. Seth MacFarlane's relationship with Family Guy followed this exact arc, and understanding it is essential to understanding why the show changed in the ways it changed. In the early years, the first 3 seasons and into the revival, MacFarlane was everywhere on Family Guy, not just as the voice of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, not just as the credited creator, as the active, daily, hands-on creative force that shaped every element of what the show was. He had opinions about the jokes, about the stories, about the character dynamics, about the animation, about the tone. He was the filter through which everything passed, and the existence of that filter is what gave the early show its remarkable consistency of voice. When you watch a Season 1 episode, you feel that someone very specific had a very specific vision and executed it with precision. That someone was Seth MacFarlane. The writing staff he assembled around himself in those early years was specifically selected for alignment with his sensibilities. Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, these were writers whose instincts complemented and amplified MacFarlane's own. The show had a genuine point of view in those early years, because a person with a genuine point of view was steering it. Then the cancellations came, and the cancellations scattered the writing room. And then the revival came, and with new writers came new sensibilities. And then MacFarlane's career began to expand in ways that pulled his attention in multiple directions. The movie Ted, which he wrote, directed, produced, and starred in, came out in 2012 and earned over $500 million worldwide. A Million Ways to Die in the West followed in 2014, Ted 2 Inches 2015. The Orville, his science fiction series, premiered in 2017 on Fox before moving to Hulu. A live-action Ted prequel series for Peacock launched in 2024. He was releasing albums of big band and jazz standards. He was hosting the Academy Awards. He was doing stand-up. He was, by any measure, one of the most in-demand and most diversified creators in Hollywood. By approximately 2011, MacFarlane had stepped back from an active creative role in Family Guy. He continued to voice the characters, which meant he was still in the recording booth for every episode, giving Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire their voices, but the writing, the story planning, the creative direction, the day-to-day decisions about what the show should be doing and where it should be going, all of that had been handed off to other people. The show-running duties passed to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, who had both been with the show for years and knew its world intimately. This distinction is crucial. Knowing a show intimately is not the same as having created it. A showrunner who inherits a show brings their own sensibilities to it, their own sense of what's funny and what's too far, their own instincts about character and story. In the best cases, inherited stewardship can be as good as original creation. There are examples throughout television history of shows that thrived under creative leadership that wasn't the original creator. But in Family Guy's case, the specific thing that MacFarlane provided the exact calibration of when something was the right kind of wrong versus the wrong kind of wrong, the specific instinct for where the character's edges were and when those edges were being pushed too hard was not something that could be fully transferred or replicated. MacFarlane himself has been characteristically candid about his reduced involvement, though he frames it with more positivity than the observable results necessarily warrant. In a 2022 interview conducted around the show's 400th episode, he noted that while he had stepped away from the Family Guy writer's room quite a while ago, he believed his creative voice was still an integral part of the show. Appel and Sulkin, for their part, said that MacFarlane's voice was present in the production even in his absence. that his sensibility had so thoroughly shaped the show's world and characters that it continued to inform decisions made without him. This may be true, but there is a difference between a sensibility that shapes decisions through osmosis and a person who is actively making those decisions, and the decline of Family Guy across precisely the period when MacFarlane stepped back suggests that the difference matters. The tension between MacFarlane and Fox as an institution became one of the defining dynamics of this period. MacFarlane is politically liberal, publicly outspoken, and deeply uncomfortable with association with Fox News. The 2007 incident, when Fox aired episodes without his permission during the writer's strike, damaged a relationship that was already complicated by years of scheduling decisions and network interference. As the years went on, MacFarlane became increasingly vocal about his frustration with being creatively tied to a network whose political sibling he found embarrassing. In 2018, he tweeted that Tucker Carlson's commentary made him embarrassed to work for Fox. In 2021, he compared his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage, writing that the sex was only once a year, he didn't get along with their mother, and he had been having an affair with NBC. The NBC reference was to the $200 million deal he had signed with NBC Universal in January of 2020, formally moving his production company away from Fox and toward Comcast's network family. This created an unusual and, in some ways, unprecedented situation. The creator of one of Fox's most prominent shows was actively and publicly saying he wished his show was somewhere else. He remained contractually obligated to voice the characters, which kept him physically present in the production, but his creative investment was clearly elsewhere, and the projects he was building his future around were at NBC Universal. His newer work, The Orville, the TED series on Peacock, bore the marks of a creator who was fully engaged and excited about what he was making. Family Guy, by contrast, felt like an obligation being maintained rather than a passion being expressed. MacFarlane's public statements about the show's continued existence in the 2020s have been notably absent of artistic enthusiasm. In a 2024 interview, when asked about the show's future, he said that he didn't see a good reason to stop because people still loved it, that it made people happy and helped fund causes he cared about through charitable contributions. He described the show as having reached a kind of escape velocity, having been going long enough that there was no obvious reason to stop unless the audience stopped caring. He framed the show's continuation in terms of utility. It was useful, it served purposes rather than in terms of creative excitement. This is a very different energy from the young man who pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in 1998 with such evident enthusiasm that they gave him a series order almost on the spot. That person had stories he wanted to tell, characters he was excited about, a specific vision he was burning to execute. The MacFarlane of 2024, by contrast, described Family Guy in the language of financial vehicles and charitable giving. Not as a bad thing, those are legitimate reasons to keep doing something, but as a definitive indication that the artistic heart had moved elsewhere. The 4-season renewal deal announced in April 2025, securing Family Guy through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, taking the show to its 30th anniversary, cemented this reality. The show was not being renewed because its creator had a burning vision for what the next 4 years could be. It was being renewed because the economics made sense, because the streaming numbers were strong, because the brand remained valuable even as the live viewership had declined to numbers that would have caused cancellation under different economic conditions. The show had become a machine that ran on its own momentum, and Seth MacFarlane was one component of that machine rather than the person who built it and understood why it worked. None of this is MacFarlane's fault in any simple sense. He is not obligated to spend his entire career on a single project, especially one that was canceled twice before it found its audience. He has built an extraordinary career across multiple formats and disciplines, and the fact that Family Guy continued in his reduced presence was a choice by many parties, not just him. But the consequence of his reduced presence is inseparable from the show's quality decline. The person who built the thing and cared about making it excellent was gradually replaced, in the day-to-day work of making Family Guy, by people who cared about the show but didn't love it the way he had in the beginning. And that distinction, caring about something versus loving, it turns out to be the difference between maintaining a legacy and merely preserving its appearance. There is perhaps no clearer evidence of this than comparing Family Guy in its later seasons to The Orville, McFarlane's science fiction series that premiered on Fox in 2017 before moving to Hulu. The Orville is a show that McFarlane clearly loves, in the way he once loved Family Guy. He writes it, directs much of it, acts in it, and brings to it a level of personal investment that is visible in every episode. The show began as what appeared to be a lighter comedy drama in the vein of classic science fiction television, but evolved over its seasons into something genuinely ambitious, philosophically engaged, emotionally complex, willing to take risks and sit with their consequences in a way that Family Guy had long since stopped doing. Critics who had followed McFarlane's career noted the contrast explicitly. The creator was making his best work in a different context, while the franchise that had made him famous coasted on its legacy. This parallel makes the story of Family Guy's decline even more pointed. The capacity for the kind of creative excellence the show demonstrated in its early seasons never left McFarlane. It simply found somewhere else to go. The show that bore his name continued without that capacity fully engaged, and the gap between what he was capable of and what Family Guy was delivering widened with each passing season. Section 11. The rise of shock value over smart writing. One of the most useful distinctions in the analysis of comedy is the one between darkness that serves the joke and darkness that is the joke. Dark humor, when it works, takes something uncomfortable or taboo and finds within it a truth that is funny precisely because nobody is supposed to say it. The darkness is the setup, the wit is the punchline. You laugh because the insight is sharp, because the observation is true, because the writer found a way through the darkness to something that illuminates it. This is difficult to do. It requires genuine intelligence and care, because the line between dark comedy and simply unpleasant content is fine and easily crossed. Family Guy in its early seasons walked that line with impressive skill. The show made jokes about things that other shows wouldn't touch, and it made them well enough that even viewers who were initially uncomfortable found themselves laughing. The jokes about religion, about politics, about death, about the specific absurdities of American culture, these worked because someone had thought carefully about where exactly the funny thing was hiding inside the uncomfortable subject. The darkness was in service of something. It was pointing at a truth, however strange or uncomfortable. What replaced that in the later seasons was something functionally different, even if it looked similar on the surface. The show continued to push into uncomfortable territory. It continued to make jokes about dark subjects, but the care that had been present in the construction of those jokes was largely absent. In its place was a different approach. Show something extreme, wait for the audience to react, count the reaction as the win. The shock was the point. The intensity was the point. Not what the intensity illuminated, not what truth the discomfort revealed, not what wit was visible on the other side of the transgression, just the transgression itself. The physical violence trajectory that we've referenced in earlier sections is the clearest illustration of this. In the original seasons, Family Guy's violence was in the tradition of animated slapstick, exaggerated, consequence-free, fundamentally not serious. Characters got hurt in ways that were clearly impossible and immediately recovered. The violence was a delivery mechanism for physical comedy, nothing more. It was not meant to disturb, and it didn't. Starting around season 8 and accelerating through subsequent seasons, the violence became graphic in ways that moved it out of the category of comedy and into the category of content that was primarily disturbing. Injuries depicted in detail, blood present as a specific visual element. The show drawing what was happening to bodies in ways that went far beyond what the comedy required, into territory that appeared to be doing something else, testing the audience's tolerance, measuring their discomfort, treating the discomfort itself as the goal. The gross-out humor followed the same trajectory. Comedy has always had a place for physical grossness. There's a reason that bodily functions have been funny since the beginning of human storytelling. But the difference between a quick gross-out moment that arrives as a surprising punctuation to a joke and an extended scene of bodily grossness that is itself the entire content of the scene is the difference between an ingredient and a course. In the early seasons, the gross moments were brief and surprising. In the later seasons, entire scenes were sometimes constructed around maximizing the audience's discomfort without any accompanying wit. The writers seemed to be operating on the assumption that if they could generate a strong enough reaction, that reaction constituted success, regardless of whether a joke was technically present. The show's approach to sensitive cultural subjects followed the same pattern. The early show handled race, gender, religion, sexuality, and other fraught areas with what you might call sophisticated clumsiness, aware enough of what it was doing to find the actual funny thing inside the uncomfortable subject, clumsy enough in execution that it sometimes missed, but ambitious enough to keep reaching. The later seasons lost the ambition. The sensitivity became bluntness. The jokes about difficult subjects in the later seasons often don't appear to contain any insight at all. They simply point at the subject and wait for the discomfort of that pointing to register as humor. This is the lowest form of transgressive comedy, and it ages the fastest, because without any insight to anchor them, these jokes reveal themselves very quickly as nothing more than provocation. The political content followed a similar path, but with its own specific problems. The early show's political humor was pointed but relatively even-handed. In its mockery, it was perfectly capable of finding stupidity across the political spectrum. The later seasons, particularly through Brian, became markedly one-directional. The show had opinions and it wanted you to have them too. Entire episodes were structured around making sure the audience left with a specific political conclusion. This is legitimately a creative choice that some shows make effectively, but Family Guy was not built for it, and the result was that episodes that prioritized message over entertainment felt preachy in exactly the way that entertainment is not supposed to feel. Even viewers who agreed with the positions being expressed found the delivery irritating, because the mode was lecture rather than comedy. The fourth wall breaking that accelerated in this period had its own specific frustration. Acknowledging that the show has problems is not the same as not having those problems. A show that makes jokes about its own declining quality is not funnier than a show that simply was good. It's just a show that knows it's not as good as it used to be and has decided that naming this is somehow equivalent to addressing it. The specific meta joke of a character saying, "I know we've been doing this show for too long," or "this is definitely one of the weaker jokes," is only funny if it arrives in the context of a show that is otherwise firing on all cylinders. When it arrives in the context of a show that is genuinely struggling, it reads less as wit and more as deflection. The overall effect of the shift from smart writing to shock value was that Family Guy lost what had made it singular. In the beginning, the show's brand of comedy was specific enough that it was recognizable at the level of the individual joke. You could watch a Family Guy cutaway and know, with no context, that it was a Family Guy cutaway not just because of the visual style but because of the specific quality of the wit, the specific kind of observation being made. By the later seasons, the individual jokes were less distinguishable. The shock content, the extended physical gags, the political monologues, these could have come from any number of shows operating at the same level of ambition. The show had become generic in the specific way that happens when the thing that made it distinctive is replaced by the thing that seems most likely to generate a reaction. And the thing about reactions is that they are finite. You can shock an audience once with a specific thing, maybe twice. After that, the audience has been habituated, and the next shock has to be bigger to generate the same response. This is the logic of escalation, and it's a logic without a happy ending. A show built on wit can be funny forever, because there are infinite things to be clever about. A show built on shock hits a ceiling, and beyond that ceiling, the only way to continue is to go somewhere that the audience genuinely doesn't want to go. Family Guy reached that ceiling in the middle of its extended run and, rather than changing the formula, chose to push through it and see what was on the other side. What was on the other side was viewership decline, critical dismissal, and the kind of audience fatigue that no amount of Disney money or streaming numbers can fully disguise. Section 12. The Ratings Freefall, The Business Machine, and American Dad's Quiet Triumph. Numbers don't lie, but they also don't explain themselves. The ratings history of Family Guy is a story that can be read in pure data if you want to, but the data becomes meaningful only when you put it in the context of everything we've discussed tonight. The character changes, the creative choices, the institutional shifts, the gradual replacement of passion with profitability. When you hold the numbers up against that context, what you see is not just a show losing viewers, you see the audience responding, in the most direct way possible, to the choices that were made. The beginning of the numbers story is spectacular by any measure. The first episode of Family Guy airing right after Super Bowl 33 on the 31st of January 1999, pulled in 22 million viewers. Even accounting for the Super Bowl bump, the show's first season averaged 12.8 million households and ranked number 33 in the overall Nielsen ratings. For a brand new animated comedy on a broadcast network, those were genuine numbers, not spectacular by the standards of the biggest shows of the era, but substantial and meaningful. The second and third season numbers declined, but that decline was largely attributable to Fox's scheduling chaos rather than to any inherent weakness in the show. The network moved the show to Thursday nights against Frasier, one of the era's most popular comedies. Then it moved it to Tuesday nights against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Neither time slot gave the show a chance to build or maintain audience, and the numbers reflected that instability. This was a scheduling failure, not a quality failure, and the subsequent explosion of popularity on Adult Swim confirmed as much. The show was good. It just couldn't find its audience when the network kept hiding it in different places. The return in 2005 generated genuine excitement. Season 4's premiere drew over 11 million viewers, a remarkable number for a show that had been off the air for 3 years. From that high point, the decline began. It was slow enough in the early years to explain away season to season. The drops were modest, within the range of normal variation for any show dealing with an increasingly fragmented television landscape. By season 13, airing in 2014 and 2015, the average viewership had fallen to around 5.86 million, a meaningful decline from the revival peak, but still a substantial audience, by the standards of adult animated comedy. And then the floor started to drop away. Season 20, which aired in 2021 and 2022, averaged 1.31 million viewers with a 0.45 rating in the key 18 to 49 demographic that advertisers care most about. Compare that to the 11.85 million viewers of the Season 4 premiere, and you are looking at a loss of more than 90% of the peak revival audience in less than 20 years. Season 21 dropped to 1.14 million viewers. Season 22 was at around 972,000. Season 23, which aired starting in late 2024, landed at an average of just 723,000 viewers. Fewer people watching new episodes of Family Guy live than live in many mid-sized American cities. The network responded to the declining numbers in ways that sent their own clear messages. For most of its run, Family Guy had been one of the centerpieces of Fox's animation domination Sunday night lineup, Prime Real Estate, one of the flagship programs of the network's most prominent programming block. In 2019, the show was moved from its longtime 9 p.m. Sunday slot to the less prominent 9:30 position. Then, for the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, Family Guy was moved off Sunday nights entirely, relocated to Wednesday evenings. The last time Family Guy had aired on a weekday was in 2002, before its first revival, and it had been in that position because the network was trying to hide it from the competition in the final phases of its pre-cancellation decay. Being moved from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights is, in the vocabulary of network television, the equivalent of being told that you are no longer a headliner. Yet the show kept getting renewed. The April 2025 announcement of a 4-season renewal deal with Disney, securing Family Guy through seasons 24, 25, 26, and 27, extending the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season, and coinciding with its 30th anniversary, seemed paradoxical to anyone watching the live viewership numbers. How do you justify guaranteeing 4 additional seasons to a show whose weekly audience has fallen below 1 million? The answer is that live broadcast viewership is no longer the only, or even the primary, metric by which shows are evaluated. Family Guy, over 25 years, has become something that exists at multiple levels of the entertainment economy simultaneously. It streams on Hulu. It airs in syndication on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, FXX, and other cable networks. It generates merchandise revenue from a range of products. Its individual episodes and clips are among the most widely viewed animated content on platforms like YouTube and TikTok. According to industry reporting around the 2025 renewal, Family Guy had been Fox's most streamed program for nearly a decade, averaging 9.4 million viewers per week when all viewing platforms were combined. The show ranked in the top 10 most streamed programs in the United States, with 42.4, 4 billion minutes viewed in the 2023 to 2024 period. These numbers tell a different story than the live broadcast numbers. Family Guy is still being consumed, widely and consistently, across a large audience. It is just being consumed differently on demand, in fragments, through clips and compilations, rather than through scheduled weekly viewing. The economics of this consumption model are what keep the show running, even as its traditional metrics decline. It is cheap to produce relative to live-action television. It generates value in every part of the entertainment ecosystem. And as long as those economics hold, the show will continue. This is precisely what makes the whole story of Family Guy's decline both understandable and a little sad. The show is not going away. It will continue to exist for the foreseeable future, locked in by 4-season deals and streaming agreements and 30 years of brand equity. The question of whether it is still good, in the way that a show can be good, creatively vibrant, character-driven, emotionally resonant, funny in ways that go deeper than shock and easier than wit, that question has been effectively decoupled from the question of whether it will continue to be made. And here is where the final and perhaps most damning piece of evidence arrives. Because while Family Guy was making the choices that we've traced throughout this long conversation, another show was making different choices. A show created by the same person, launched at the same time, given far less attention and far less cultural cachet, and yet over the years becoming quietly, without fanfare, largely without the kind of widespread cultural conversation that Family Guy generated in its peak years, genuinely, consistently, measurably better. That show is American Dad. American Dad premiered on the 6th of February 2005, created by Seth MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. It followed the Smith family: Stan, a conservative CIA agent, his wife Francine, their daughter Haley, their son Steve, Roger, an alien living in their attic, and Klaus, a goldfish who was actually a man whose brain had been placed into a fish body by the CIA. On paper, it sounded like a slightly weirder version of Family Guy. Critics in 2005 were largely unimpressed. Early reviews described it as derivative, as a lesser copy of the original, as MacFarlane padding his schedule rather than bringing something genuinely new to the table. For a while, that criticism was somewhat fair. The first season of American Dad leaned heavily on political satire in ways that were one note. Stan's extreme conservatism was the dominant joke, which limited the show considerably. The ratings were decent but not spectacular. Nobody was calling it the better show. But then something happened that Family Guy didn't manage. American Dad got better. Not just a little better. Significantly, consistently, and measurably better. Season by season, as Family Guy was making the choices described throughout this narrative, American Dad was doing the opposite. The key structural difference is the one that seems simplest, but has the most profound effects. American Dad doesn't use cutaway gags. Without that escape hatch, the writers had no choice but to make every episode work as an actual story. Every joke had to come from the characters and the situations they were in. Every funny moment had to be earned through the plot. This forced discipline resulted, over time, in a writing room that had genuinely developed skills in character-based storytelling skills that the Family Guy room had never had to develop because the cutaway was always available as an alternative. The characters on American Dad avoided the flanderization that damaged the Family Guy cast. Stan Smith started as a one-dimensional political caricature and grew over multiple seasons into a complex person stubborn and frequently wrong, but also genuinely loving of his family and capable of real growth. He made mistakes. He learned from them. Sometimes he didn't learn, but the show noticed that he didn't learn, and the failure to learn was itself part of who he was rather than just an oversight. He had the quality that Peter Griffin lost somewhere around season 8. You understood why he did what he did, even when what he did was wrong. Roger the Alien became one of the most beloved characters in adult animation through a concept of almost inexhaustible creative generosity. Roger could adopt any persona, becoming entirely different characters with different names, backstories, and personalities. This gave the writers an effectively infinite source of material. Every episode could feature a new Roger, each one more elaborately absurd than the last, without the character ever feeling stale, because the concept was designed for constant evolution. Compare this to what happened to Stewie, a character with an equally original concept who was retired and replaced rather than evolved. Because the writers didn't trust themselves to keep finding new things to do with an evil genius baby. The relationship between Stan and his daughter Haley sustained a creative tension throughout the show's run. A patriarchal, conservative father and his liberal, idealistic daughter in perpetual philosophical collision that was mined for comedy without becoming a lecture from either direction. Both characters could be right, both could be wrong. The show didn't resolve the tension by making one of them correct and the other a straw man. It lived in the tension, which is where the richest comedy tends to be. The warmth that Family Guy lost after its revival era is present throughout American Dad's entire run. The Smiths are a dysfunctional family, deeply strange, frequently terrible to each other in the specific ways that deeply strange families are terrible, but they love each other. The love is present even in the most chaotic episodes, even in the most outlandish storylines, even when Roger is doing something genuinely psychotic or Stan is enforcing a position that is clearly wrong. The show never let that love evaporate the way Family Guy did. The irony of the American Dad story is precise and a little uncomfortable. MacFarlane was less involved with American Dad creatively than he was with Family Guy. The day-to-day stewardship of American Dad passed primarily to Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman from early on, and later to Brian Boyle and Weitzman. These were the people who made the creative decisions that took American Dad from a mediocre copy of Family Guy to something that most serious fans of animated comedy now regard as the superior show. The show MacFarlane cared about most, the one that bore his vision most directly, declined. The show that he handed off and that others developed and protected through careful stewardship and specific creative philosophy got better. American Dad even handled a major network transition more gracefully than Family Guy managed its reduced position on Fox. When the show moved from Fox to TBS after its 11th season in 2014, many observers predicted that the move would effectively end it, that without the platform of a major broadcast network, the show would fade into obscurity. Instead, the move gave the writers more creative freedom, and the show continued to produce excellent episodes without the constraints of broadcast standards. It was later part of the April 2025 megadeal that brought it back to Fox for 4 additional seasons alongside The Simpsons, Family Guy, and Bob's Burgers. The American Dad comparison is important not as an attack on Family Guy, but as a refutation of the most common defense offered for the show's decline. The usual argument is that any show will deteriorate after 20 or more seasons, that creative fatigue is inevitable, that no comedy can sustain its quality across that kind of timeline, that the decline of Family Guy is simply what happens to things that go on for too long. This argument sounds reasonable in the abstract, but American Dad has been running for roughly the same length of time as Family Guy and has not experienced the same catastrophic decline. It proves that longevity alone doesn't doom a show. What dooms a show is the specific choices made by specific people along the way. Family Guy chose cutaway dependency over storytelling. American Dad chose the harder work of building plots that had to earn their comedy. Family Guy chose to Flanderize its characters into unrecognizable versions of themselves. American Dad chose to develop its characters while preserving what was essential about them. Family Guy chose shock value and volume. American Dad chose intelligence and specificity. These were choices, made by people, at specific moments. Not inevitable, not the natural result of time passing. Choices. There is something additionally instructive in looking at how American Dad handled the specific challenge of comedic serialization. One of the structural advantages it has over Family Guy is that because its characters exist in a world without cutaway gags, they have to generate comedy through interaction rather than through observation. Stan and Francine, Stan and Haley, Roger, and any other character in any episode, the comedy of those pairings is situational and relational, dependent on who these people specifically are and what happens when those specific people are placed in specific circumstances. This is harder to write than a standalone gag that doesn't require character knowledge to land, but it produces comedy with deeper roots and longer life. You find Stan's behavior funny not just because it is objectively funny, but because you understand him, because you know why he does what he does, and you've seen enough of who he is to know when he's being himself, versus when he's going against his nature. This kind of character-based comedy compounds over time in a way that cutaway-based comedy cannot. The audience's knowledge of the characters deepens with each episode, which means the comedy deepens too. A joke in American Dad's 14th season can land harder than the same joke would have in its 4th season, because the audience by then has 14 seasons of context for why it's funny. A cutaway in Family Guy's 14th season is no funnier than a cutaway in its 4th season, because cutaways don't accumulate, each one arrives fresh, works or doesn't based on its individual construction, and disappears without adding anything to the store of knowledge the audience has about the characters. This is why American Dad, despite being the show that fewer people have heard of, is the show that the people who have watched both tend to prefer. It rewards investment. It grows with you. It is more satisfying the more you know it, because its comedy is rooted in people rather than in moments. Family Guy, by contrast, became less satisfying the more you knew it, because the more you knew it, the more you were aware of how far the characters had drifted from the people you had originally cared about. The American Dad case also proves something about what it means to protect a creative vision in the absence of its original creator. MacFarlane left both shows. American Dad flourished in his absence. Family Guy declined in his absence. The difference was what the people left in charge of each show decided to value and protect. The American Dad showrunners Barker and Weitzman first, Boyle and Weitzman later made choices that prioritized character consistency, emotional warmth, and story-based comedy. They protected the things that made the show worth watching even when they could have taken easier paths. The Family Guy showrunners, operating under different pressures and perhaps with different instincts about what the audience wanted, made choices that prioritized spectacle, shock, and the individually viral moment over the accumulated value of a well-maintained creative world. Neither set of choices was inevitable. Both were made by specific people with specific values about what television was for and what it owed its audience. That American Dad got it right and Family Guy got it wrong is the conclusion that anyone who watches both shows seriously eventually arrives at. And it is the conclusion that makes Family Guy's story not just sad, but avoidable. Section 13. What Family Guy meant to television and why it still matters. Before we arrive at the conclusion, there is one more thing worth dwelling on: the show's cultural impact, which was real and lasting and cannot be separated from the story of its decline, because the impact is part of why the decline stings so much. Family Guy changed what animated comedy was allowed to do. Not alone, South Park had been doing transgressive, boundary-breaking animation for 2 years before Family Guy premiered, and The Simpsons had defined the genre before either of them. But Family Guy did something specific that the other shows didn't quite do in the same way. It made the non sequitur respectable. It legitimized the cutaway gag as a proper comedic form. It demonstrated that an animated comedy could sustain absurdist tangents without losing its structural integrity, that you could take a mainstream sitcom premise and fill it with jokes that had no business being on network television, and that an audience existed for that exact combination. The influence of this on subsequent animation was enormous. Shows like Bob's Burgers, Archer, Rick and Morty, and a dozen others owe something to the specific comedic permission that Family Guy established. The idea that adult animated comedy could be smart and strange and willing to go places that live-action television that idea was present before Family Guy, but Family Guy made it commercially viable in a way that opened doors for what came after. When you watch an animated comedy that makes a joke you can't believe just happened on television, the genealogy of that moment runs through Family Guy. The show was also important for what it did to animated television's relationship with the internet. Family Guy was, in a meaningful sense, the first show built for the clip era. The cutaway gag short, self-contained, complete in itself, was the perfect unit of internet distribution. Before YouTube, before social media, before the clip culture that now defines how entertainment is consumed and shared, Family Guy was producing content in the exact format that would eventually dominate online video. The show became one of the most watched programs on the early internet, not because anyone planned it that way, but because its structure happened to align perfectly with how people wanted to consume comedy in a digital environment. The millions of views on individual Family Guy clips in the YouTube era were not an accident of algorithm or promotion. They were the result of a show that had accidentally invented the internet video format before the internet video format existed. The early seasons of Family Guy were also genuinely influential at the level of craft. The precision of the comedy in those first years, the timing of the cutaways, the way the dialogue was constructed to land at exactly the right moment, the specific rhythms of the jokes, these were teaching tools for a generation of comedy writers who were paying attention. You can trace the influence of early Family Guy, writing in the work of people who came up in the 2000s and 2010s. Not imitation, but absorption, the internalization of a particular approach to comedy that was then applied in different contexts and directions. It is also worth acknowledging what the show meant to the specific generation that grew up with it, the kids who watched it on DVD in the mid-2000s, who discovered Adult Swim reruns at midnight, who wore out their quotations of it at school in the way that every generation wears out its references to the things that spoke to them. For those people, Family Guy was not just a show. It was a kind of shared language, a set of references that marked you as a member of a specific cultural moment. To quote Family Guy correctly and fluently in 2005 was to be recognized. To know why something was funny, in the specific way that the show required you to know it, to have the cultural vocabulary that the references were drawing on, was to belong to a community of people who had been paying the same kind of attention to the same things. That cultural function is real and it matters, and the fact that the later seasons never quite recaptured that feeling of shared discovery is part of why the decline felt so personal to so many people. The early show felt like something you found, something that hadn't fully been claimed yet, that was yours in a way that shows which arrive with massive cultural fanfare never quite are. The later show felt like a product well distributed, easily found, everywhere, and belonging to no one in particular. The discovery was gone. And with the discovery went the sense of ownership, and with the ownership went some of the love. The characters, in their original forms, joined the canon of animated icons in a way that very few characters manage. The Peter Griffin of the early seasons, the lovable idiot who meant well, became one of the template characters for working-class father comedies and animation that followed. The Brian of those same seasons, the intelligent, flawed, striving companion, became a model for the articulate animal sidekick character. Stewie, in his original evil genius incarnation, joined a very short list of animated characters who are genuinely original in concept rather than variations on something that existed before. These characters were worth something beyond their function in the show's plots. They were worth something to the culture. This is exactly why the decline of those characters hurts the way it hurts. When the thing that's lost was genuinely valuable, not just entertaining but culturally significant, not just funny but artistically original, the loss carries a different weight. Peter Griffin becoming cruel isn't just a show getting worse. It's the degradation of something that mattered to people. Brian becoming a fraud isn't just a character arc going wrong. It's the betrayal of a character who represented something worth representing, the smart, struggling person trying to find their place in a world that doesn't always make room for them. Stewie's retirement as the evil genius isn't just a creative miscalculation. It's the elimination of a genuinely irreplaceable comic creation. The show's 2009 Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first animated show to receive that honor since The Flintstones in 1961, captures perfectly the height from which it fell. Family Guy in 2009 was being seriously discussed as one of the best comedies on television in any format. Not best animated comedy, best comedy period. That conversation was possible because the show, in the episodes that had earned the nomination, had demonstrated that it could operate at the level of the finest live-action comedy being produced. The talent was that real. The achievement was that real. And then, in the years that followed that nomination, the show made the specific choices that took it away from that conversation and eventually out of the conversation about quality entirely. The show that earned the Emmy nomination and the show that airs on Wednesday nights in 2026 are connected by a name and a set of voices, and nothing else that matters in the way that the original things mattered. And yet, and this is the complication at the heart of any honest assessment of Family Guy, both of those things are Family Guy. The brilliant early seasons and the diminished later seasons are part of the same story, told by some of the same people, featuring the same characters in the same world. You cannot have one without the other. The show that mattered also became the show that disappointed. The characters who were extraordinary also became characters who let you down. That is its own kind of tragedy, specific to things that start great and decline, rather than things that never tried in the first place. There is, in the broader history of entertainment, no shame in having once been great. Most things are never great at all. The shame, if shame is the right word, which it may not be, is in the choices that took something great and gradually made it ordinary. In the specific human decisions that, accumulated over years and seasons, converted one of the medium's genuine achievements into a product that runs on business logic rather than creative passion. That is the real story of Family Guy. Not the greatness was obvious and real. But the specific mechanism by which the greatness was allowed to erode, and the specific people and choices and institutional pressures that enabled that erosion, understanding that mechanism is useful beyond Family Guy. The story of a show that starts brilliant and becomes merely competent is not unique to this one franchise. It happens constantly in television, and in music, and in film, and in every creative field where initial inspiration is replaced over time by institutional momentum. The specific manifestation is different each time. The underlying pattern is the same. Something is built with care and passion. Then the care and passion are gradually replaced by habit and profitability, and the thing that remains at the end of the process bears the marks of its original greatness while no longer embodying the qualities that created it. Family Guy is a particularly clear and well-documented example of this pattern because it happened in front of so many people over such a long period of time with so much evidence available for examination. The early seasons and the later seasons are both still accessible. The choices are on the record. The consequences are measurable. It is, in that sense, one of the great instructional texts of modern television history. A detailed, specific, painful account of how to take something excellent and, through accumulated choices, make it something much less. Section 14. The long view, what remains and what was lost. There is a version of this story that ends with simple condemnation, with the conclusion that Family Guy failed, that the people who made it after its golden years failed it, and that the show as it exists today is simply worse in every way than the show that launched in 1999. That version is easier, and there are elements of it that are accurate. But it's not quite the whole truth. The truth is more complicated and in some ways more melancholy. Family Guy at its best in those first 3 seasons, and in scattered brilliant episodes throughout the revival era, was genuinely one of the best animated comedies ever made. It was inventive in ways that changed what animated comedy was allowed to do. It created characters who felt real in ways that shouldn't have been possible given how inherently absurd the premise was. It found a balance between darkness and warmth that most comedy shows never achieve. It made people laugh in a way that also made them feel something, which is the rarest combination in the genre. That quality didn't entirely disappear when the decline set in. The show, even in its most troubled periods, produced individual episodes that recalled what it had been. The Brian and Stewie Vault episode, the Peter's Sister episode with Meg, various Road to Adventures. Moments of genuine insight scattered across years of mediocrity, like fossils of the original creature visible in the rock that had formed around them. These moments prove that the talent never fully left. The writers who produced them were capable of the kind of work that had made the original seasons great. They were just being asked to do something different most of the time. The larger decline was a product of specific forces that we've traced throughout this narrative. The loss of the original creative vision through writer turnover and creator disengagement, the institutional incentives that rewarded shock and individual viral moments over sustained storytelling, the decision to push characters beyond the edges of what had made them lovable, the transformation of a creative tool into a creative crutch. The gradual replacement of passion with profitability in the show's fundamental relationship to its own existence. None of these things were inevitable. Each was a choice. American Dad proves it. The early seasons of Family Guy prove it. The exceptional later episodes prove it. The show was capable of being better than it was for most of its extended run, and the fact that it wasn't is the product of human decisions made in specific rooms at specific times, not of some immutable law of television gravity. Consider what could have been, just briefly, as a way of measuring the gap. A version of Family Guy that maintained the character integrity of the early seasons would have given us a Peter Griffin, who grew, however slowly and imperfectly, across 20-plus years, a genuinely evolved working-class father whose relationship with his family deepened and complicated over time in ways that felt earned. A version that protected Brian would have given us one of the most sustained and thoughtful explorations of intellectual aspiration in mainstream comedy, a character whose failures had the texture of real failure rather than performance. A version that kept Stewie as the evil genius finding new expressions for the concept across each season would have remained unlike anything else in animation, continuously reinventing itself from within. A version that allowed Meg to grow would have traced one of the most resonant arcs in animated television. The ordinary kid in an extraordinary family finding her own extraordinary. None of these things required abandoning what made the show funny. They didn't require making it slow, or sentimental, or dramatically serious. The early show was all of these things charming, warm, growing, genuinely funny simultaneously. The choice to abandon the warmth and the growth in pursuit of shock and spectacle was not a creative necessity. It was a shortcut that saved work in the short term and cost something irreplaceable in the long term. What remains of Family Guy, as it enters its 30th year of existence through the mega deal that locked in 4 more seasons in 2025, is something different from what it was, but not entirely without value. The show still produces episodes that are funny. It still employs talented voice actors doing remarkable work with characters they have inhabited for decades. It still generates the kind of genuine connection with an audience that keeps people watching even when they have complicated feelings about what they're watching. McFarlane's performances as Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire remain technically impressive and often genuinely moving in their specific way. There is something about the level of commitment he brings to those voices, even across all these years, that speaks to a relationship with the characters that hasn't entirely cooled. And the original seasons are still there. They don't go away. The show that existed in 1999 through 2002 smart, warm, original, funny in ways that felt genuinely new, is preserved in every DVD set and streaming archive and late-night Adult Swim rerun. The Peter Griffin who loved his family and felt bad when he hurt them. The Brian who was genuinely wise and genuinely kind underneath the dry wit. The Stewie who was building weapons in his crib and plotting the elimination of his mother between naps. The Meg who just wanted to be seen. The early show is still there for anyone who wants to find it, and the early show is still brilliant. What was lost is the continuity between that show and what followed it. The loss is not of Family Guy entirely, but of the through line, the sense that the show you loved in its first years was the same show, grown and developed but recognizable, that was continuing to tell stories about the same people in the same world. That through line broke somewhere in the transition from the original run to the revival, and it kept breaking with each successive season as more of the original qualities were replaced. The show that exists now shares a name, a set of voice actors, and a collection of settings and character designs with the show that premiered in 1999. In almost every other respect, it is a different thing. This is the specific sadness of Family Guy's story, and the specific reason it continues to generate such passionate engagement from people who care about it. Not the sadness of watching something fail, but the sadness of watching something that was once extraordinary become ordinary. Of watching the specific qualities that made a piece of art matter be removed and replaced one by one until what's left is functional but hollow. Of knowing, because the evidence is right there in the early seasons, exactly what it could have been, and comparing that to what it became. The golden years are what they are, genuinely golden. They represent some of the best work in animated comedy original, brave, funny in the deepest sense, capable of genuine heart. Everything after them can be understood as the long, complicated process of a show trying to maintain something it had stopped truly understanding. Some of that process was good, much of it wasn't. All of it was human, the product of people doing their best under conditions that were not always designed to bring out the best work. Family Guy didn't just change, it chose to change. Season by season, decision by decision. And the choices that changed it away from warmth, away from character, away from the specific creative courage that made the early seasons extraordinary, were not inevitable. They were not the natural result of time passing or stories being exhausted. They were choices made by specific people, and they had consequences. And the consequence was that one of the greatest animated comedies of its era became a reliable, profitable, largely undistinguished product that still carries its name and some of its mythology, while having abandoned most of what made that name worth carrying. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with knowing something well enough to understand exactly what it lost. Casual viewers of Family Guy, people who catch an episode occasionally, who watch it in the background without deep investment, often don't experience the show's decline in the same way that people who followed it from the beginning do. For the casual viewer, Any given episode is just an episode. It doesn't carry the weight of everything that came before it. It doesn't arrive in the context of the first 3 seasons and what those seasons promised. For people who fell in love with Family Guy in 1999, or who discovered the early seasons through Adult Swim reruns in 2003, or who wore out the Season 1 DVD in 2004, every later episode arrives in the context of everything it's not. Every cutaway that replaces a story arrives in the context of the stories that used to be there. Every moment of cruelty toward Meg arrives in the context of the girl who just wanted to fit in, who was drawn with genuine empathy in those first years. Every scene of Peter laughing at someone's pain arrives in the context of the man who used to feel bad about hurting people. This is the specific quality of caring about art. It creates the conditions for being hurt by it. The more a piece of work means to you, the more capable it is of disappointing you. Family Guy meant something to an enormous number of people, which is precisely why its decline has generated such sustained and passionate discussion for so many years. People don't write lengthy analyses of things they don't care about. The anger, the nostalgia, the persistent hope for a return to form, all of these are expressions of love for the original thing and grief for what it became. It's worth noting, as a final observation, that the show's decline was not experienced evenly by everyone who watched it. Some viewers came to the show in its later seasons and have a different relationship with it. They might find the more abrasive, shock-oriented humor funny in ways that longtime fans don't, might feel less invested in what the characters used to be. Some people have always found the show's meanness more funny than troubling. The experience of a work of art is genuinely different for different people, and dismissing the enjoyment that later season Family Guy provides to its current audience would be as wrong as pretending that the early season's qualities didn't exist. What cannot be disputed is the trajectory. The show that premiered in 1999 was doing something special, and the show that airs now is doing something considerably less special, and the distance between those two things is the measure of what the choices described throughout this narrative cost. Not everything that was lost was bad to lose. The evil baby premise may genuinely have needed to evolve, and some version of Stewie's emotional growth was probably necessary. Not everything that was gained was worthless. There are episodes in every season of the revival era that stand as evidence of the show's persistent capacity for excellence. The picture is complicated, as pictures of real things always are, but the arc is clear. And the arc goes, as the title of this conversation suggested, from great to change to something that most people who love the beginning find difficult to fully defend. The reasons for that arc are also clear. They are the specific decisions of specific people operating within specific institutional conditions, making choices that prioritized some things over others and received the consequences of those priorities. Family Guy at its best remains among the finest achievements in animated comedy. And the distance between that best and what the show became is one of the more instructive stories in the history of a medium that has produced many such stories. There is perhaps a small measure of hope at the end of this long story. The 4-season deal, locked in through 2029, ensures Family Guy's continued existence, and with it, the opportunity for the show to keep doing what it has occasionally done in recent seasons. Remembering what it was, recovering some of its lost warmth, finding in the characters it has now some of the qualities that the original versions had. It won't be the same. It can't be the same. But things that have drifted can drift back, at least partially. The exceptional later episodes prove that the creative capacity hasn't entirely gone away. It's just been underused for a very long time. The early seasons are still there for anyone who wants them. They haven't been erased by what came after. The Peter who loved his family. The Brian who actually read books. The Stewie who had plans for all of us. The Meg who just wanted to be seen. Those characters in those stories from those years, they are a permanent part of what animated television has been capable of. No amount of decline changes that. And returning to them, as so many people do when the later seasons feel like too much, is a reminder that something genuinely great existed here once. That greatness is what makes this story worth telling. And your willingness to spend this time with it, however long you've been listening, wherever you are in the world, whatever brought you to this particular piece of content on this particular night is the thing that makes the telling worthwhile. If you have thoughts, memories, disagreements, or just a favorite early episode you want to share, the comments are yours. And if you found something in this that resonated, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs nothing, and means more than you'd think. Sleep well. The early episodes will still be there in the morning. And if you're new here, if this is the first video of mine you've found, welcome. This channel is about taking things seriously, about giving the stories and the shows and the histories that matter to people the attention they deserve. There's a lot more where this came from. The subscribe button is right there, and I would love to have you along for what comes next. Until then, take care of yourself. And remember what made the things you love worth loving in the first place.